A Ferrari worth over $40 million, more than 200 of the world's finest engineers, 20 years of unbroken failure. And then, a man walks in carrying a worn metal toolbox, wearing oil-stained work clothes. No engineering degree, no corporate title, no reputation worth mentioning in a room like this. The executives laugh, the reporters smirk, the cameras roll, expecting nothing. What happens in the next 2 minutes will shock every person in that building, and eventually, the entire world. This is not a story about a car. This is a story about what happens when the world writes someone off too soon. If this story moves you, drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this one is worth every minute. The morning Evelyn Sterling turned 30, she did not celebrate. She stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window on the 42nd floor of Sterling Automotive's headquarters in downtown Chicago, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, watching the city move below her like a machine that never slept. Taxis honking, delivery trucks grinding gears, people in overcoats walking fast with their chins tucked against the November wind, everyone going somewhere, everyone with a purpose. She envied them in a way she couldn't explain to anyone who worked for her. Behind her, her executive assistant Marcus was running through the morning schedule in a low, practiced voice. Board review at 9, press conference at 11. The restoration team presenting their latest attempt at 2 in the afternoon. She had stopped listening somewhere around the board review. She already knew what the restoration team was going to say. She had been hearing variations of the same sentence for the better part of 3 years. "We're close, Ms. Sterling. Just a few more weeks." Except they were never close. And there were never just a few more weeks. "Marcus," she said, still facing the window. "Yes, ma'am." "Cancel the press conference." A pause. "The journalists are all ready to cancel it." She turned around. Her face was calm in the way that unsettled people who didn't know her well and made people who did know her brace themselves. "If we show them the car today, they're going to ask if it runs. And I'm not standing in front of a camera and lying about that. Not again." Marcus nodded, already pulling out his phone. He had worked for her for 6 years. He knew better than to argue when she used that particular tone. Evelyn set her cold coffee on the edge of her desk and picked up the photograph instead. It sat in a simple silver frame, slightly scratched on one corner, the only personal item on an otherwise immaculate desk. The photo was old, the colors slightly faded the way photographs from that era always faded, warmer and softer than reality. Her grandfather stood beside the Ferrari in the picture, his hand resting on the hood with a kind of quiet pride that didn't need to perform itself. He was grinning, not the wide, manufactured grin of a man who knew cameras were rolling, but the real one, the kind that came from somewhere deep and honest. She had been 7 years old when that photo was taken. She had been 19 when he died. The Ferrari had not started since the week of his funeral. The car itself lived in a climate-controlled restoration bay on the ground floor of the building, behind a set of reinforced glass panels that made it look more like a museum exhibit than a vehicle, which, Evelyn supposed, was essentially what it had become. It was a 1963 Ferrari 250 GTO prototype, one of a kind, never produced in series, built by her grandfather Harlan Sterling during a period when he was still young enough to believe that a man with enough stubbornness and enough money could bend the rules of both physics and corporate reality. Harlan had not been born wealthy. He had built the money himself, over 50 years of decisions that other people called reckless, and that he called obvious in retrospect. The Ferrari had been his greatest personal indulgence, a machine he'd commissioned not to race, not to sell, not to display, but simply because he wanted to understand what it felt like to be inside something truly extraordinary while it was moving. He had driven it exactly 4 times before his health made driving impossible. The engine was original. Every component was original. Harlan had left explicit instructions in his will. The car was to be restored to running condition without replacing the engine. Not modified, not rebuilt with modern parts. Restored. The distinction had seemed reasonable when the lawyers first read it aloud. It had seemed considerably less reasonable after the third restoration team walked away in frustration. The engine was a 3.0-liter V12, hand-assembled by craftsmen who were mostly dead now. The problem, every expert agreed, was electrical. Something in the ignition system had failed in a way that was proving maddeningly difficult to isolate. The car had been examined by engineers from Ferrari's own factory in Maranello, by vintage racing specialists from England and Germany, by two separate teams from American universities with motorsports engineering programs, by a retired Formula One mechanic who had worked on championship-winning cars in the 1970s and who had reportedly stared at the engine bay for 2 full hours before quietly asking to be driven back to his hotel. Nobody could find the fault. And so the Ferrari sat, beautiful and silent, behind its glass panel, neither a running car nor quite a relic. Something in between, suspended in a state that Evelyn found increasingly difficult to look at without feeling a pressure behind her sternum that she couldn't name. The restoration team presenting that afternoon was called Meridian Classic Works. They were, by any reasonable measure, the finest vintage automotive restoration company in North America. Their waiting list ran 4 years. Their previous work included 2 cars that now lived in the Smithsonian and one that had sold at auction for $63 million. When Evelyn had first contacted them 18 months ago, their founder, a compact, meticulous Swiss-German man named Dietrich Hauff, had told her that restoring the Sterling Ferrari would be the defining project of his career. He wasn't grinning when he walked into the conference room that afternoon. The conference room was on the 2nd floor, with a large window overlooking the restoration bay. The Ferrari was visible from where Evelyn sat at the head of the table, a long table of polished walnut with 14 chairs, 12 of which were currently occupied by various members of her executive team, Meridian's lead engineers, and 2 journalists from automotive publications who had been granted access under a strict embargo agreement. Dietrich set a laptop on the table and connected it to the presentation screen. He was a man who prided himself on precision in everything, including how he delivered bad news. The slides he showed were thorough, technical, and ultimately damning. They had isolated the electrical fault to the ignition system. They had identified multiple possible causes. They had tested solutions for each. None of them had worked. They were recommending at this point a partial replacement of the ignition wiring harness with period-correct reproduction components. Not original, technically, but visually and functionally indistinguishable from original, and the only path forward that Dietrich believed had a realistic chance of success. The room was quiet when he finished. Evelyn looked at the slide on the screen for a long moment. Then she looked at the Ferrari through the window. Then she looked back at Dietrich. "The will specifies original components," she said. "I'm aware of the will, Ms. Sterling." Dietrich's voice was carefully neutral. "I'm telling you that preserving the original wiring harness and achieving a reliable start are, in my professional judgment, no longer compatible goals." "Then we're not done yet," she said. Dietrich pressed his lips together. He had anticipated this. "With respect, thank you, Dietrich." She said it gently, but with a finality that ended the sentence he was about to speak. "I'll be in touch about next steps." The meeting dissolved into the particular kind of uncomfortable quiet that follows a polite dismissal. People gathered papers, closed laptops, and avoided making eye contact with each other or with Evelyn. The 2 journalists exchanged a glance that she noticed but chose not to acknowledge. She was still standing at the window, watching the Ferrari, when she heard the knock. It was Marcus at the door. Behind him stood a man who looked like he had arrived at the wrong building and hadn't quite figured that out yet. He was tall, a few inches over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from actual physical work rather than a gym, broad through the shoulders with hands that were calloused and stained in the permanent way of a man who worked with engines and metal for a living. He was wearing dark work pants and a blue canvas jacket over a plain gray shirt. His dark hair needed cutting. He was carrying a toolbox, the old-fashioned kind. Metal, painted red once upon a time, and now mostly the color of rust and use. He looked to be in his early 30s, though the slight lines around his eyes suggested either more years or harder ones than the number implied. He was looking at the Ferrari through the window with an expression that was very difficult to read. Not awe, exactly. Not the studied appreciation of an expert cataloging details. Something quieter than both of those things. "Miss Sterling," Marcus said, with the faintly apologetic tone he used when he wasn't sure how to explain something. "This is Mr. Mason Ryder. He's—" A brief pause. He called the general inquiry line this morning. He said he'd heard about the car. Several people in the room who hadn't quite finished leaving stopped moving. One of Meridian's engineers, a young man named Preston, who had an advanced degree from MIT and the confidence that tended to accompany it, turned around from where he'd been packing up his equipment. He looked at Mason with the particular expression of a person who has spent years becoming an expert in something and has just watched someone with no apparent credentials show up in their professional space. He called the general inquiry line, Preston repeated. Mason didn't look at Preston. He was still looking at the Ferrari. The ignition's not the primary issue, Mason said. His voice was unhurried, not loud, not performing anything. The room got a degree quieter. Preston made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Excuse me? Mason set his toolbox down on the floor beside him. It landed with the heavy, solid sound of something that had been carried a long way. The ignition's showing symptoms. But if your team has been chasing the ignition for this long without finding a fix, it's because the fault is upstream of where you've been looking. Preston turned fully around now, and his expression had settled into something that was trying to be patient but wasn't quite getting there. We've run full diagnostics on this vehicle, 3 separate teams, using equipment that costs more than... He gestured vaguely at Mason, in a way that was meant to encompass the toolbox, the jacket, the general impression. We've been doing this a long time. I can see that, Mason said. He said it without edge. It wasn't a compliment either. It was just an acknowledgement of a fact, the way you might note that it was raining outside. Dietrich, who had stayed in the room, studied Mason for a moment with the careful attention of a man who had learned not to dismiss things too quickly, even when they appeared dismissible. What makes you think you've identified something our teams haven't? Mason finally looked away from the car. He looked at Dietrich. I don't know that I have. I'd need to look at it. With what? Preston said. That? He nodded at the toolbox. Yeah, Mason said. With that. Someone at the back of the room laughed. Both them. It was quiet, barely audible. The kind of laugh that people produce when they want to signal to the room that they understand the joke without being so impolite as to make it loudly. But it was there. Evelyn, who had not moved from her position at the window, had been watching Mason since the moment he walked in. She was trying to identify what it was about him that was keeping her attention. He wasn't doing anything interesting by any observable measure. He was standing still and talking in a voice that barely carried across the room. He hadn't introduced himself with any credentials. He hadn't made any claims beyond a quiet disagreement with the diagnosis. But there was something about the way he had looked at that car. She had watched a lot of experts look at that car over the past 3 years. They looked at it with admiration, sometimes, with frustration, with the calculating eyes of people trying to solve a puzzle. A few of them had looked at it with a kind of resentment, the way people look at a problem that is making them feel inadequate. Mason had looked at it the way you look at something you recognize. Give him 10 minutes, Evelyn said. The room turned toward her. Miss Sterling, Dietrich started. 10 minutes, she said again. If he finds nothing, we shake hands and move on. She looked at Mason. If you find something in 10 minutes, I'm listening. Is that fair? Mason considered this for a moment. 10 minutes might be enough, he said. Might not. Depends what's in there. Then let's find out, she said. They went down to the restoration bay. The group that followed was larger than strictly necessary. Preston and 2 of the other Meridian engineers, 2 members of Evelyn's executive team, the journalists with their cameras they'd been told to keep holstered, Marcus, and Dietrich, who walked with his arms crossed and his face carefully arranged into the expression of a man keeping an open mind through considerable effort. The restoration bay was cool and brightly lit, smelling of the particular combination of old oil, metal, and cleaning chemicals that collected in spaces where machines lived. The Ferrari sat in the center of the space under a bank of overhead lights that made the red paint look almost impossibly deep. The specific shade of Italian racing red that had no entirely accurate name in English, a color that existed somewhere between crimson and blood, and something older than either. Mason crouched down beside the car first, below the driver's side door, and looked underneath the chassis for about 30 seconds without touching anything. Then he walked slowly around the car twice, the second time slower than the first. He didn't open the hood. He didn't touch the door handles. He just looked. Preston watched this with the patient expression of a man who has decided to let a situation play itself out because arguing would take longer. One of the journalists had her camera out but wasn't raising it yet, as if she was waiting to decide whether this was worth documenting. "Ground strap," Mason said, almost to himself. "What?" Preston said. Mason crouched again, this time near the rear of the car, and peered at something along the lower chassis. He reached into his toolbox without looking, the way people reach for things they've reached for 10,000 times, and came out with a small flashlight and an inspection mirror. He positioned the mirror and shone the light behind it. "There's a secondary ground strap back here," he said, connecting the chassis to the body. "On this model there should be two, one at the front, one at the rear. I'm only seeing corrosion evidence from the front one in your diagnostic reports." He looked up at Dietrich. "Did your team check the rear strap?" Dietrich was very still. The rear ground strap on a vehicle of this age would be considered a standard checkpoint. "Right," Mason said. He wasn't arguing. "Can I open the hood?" A moment of silence. Then Evelyn said, "Open the hood." The hood release was on the driver's side. Mason opened the door, and the smell that came out was the specific smell of an old car that had been meticulously preserved, leather and time, and something faintly sweet that nobody had ever quite been able to name chemically, but that everyone who worked with old vehicles recognized immediately. He leaned in and popped the hood, then moved to the front of the car and lifted it. The V12 engine was right there. 12 cylinders arranged in a V configuration, each component hand-finished to a smoothness that you didn't see in production vehicles, the kind of workmanship that predated the idea of cost efficiency. Even after 20 years of sitting, it looked like something that had been made with genuine care by people who believed that the thing they were making deserved their full attention. Mason looked at it for about 15 seconds. Then he reached back into his toolbox. "What are you doing?" Preston said. There was a tension in his voice now that hadn't been there before. "Looking for the relay cluster," Mason said, moving around to the side of the engine bay. He produced a small test light from the toolbox and a short probe. "Your diagnostic logs show the ignition switch is sending signal. Your coil is receiving signal, but nobody's checked the relay that sits between them." "We checked every relay," Preston said. "That's a fundamental diagnostic step." "You checked them for function," Mason said. He had found what he was looking for. A small cluster of components near the firewall, partially obscured by a bracket that had been installed during one of the previous restoration attempts. "You checked whether they were opening and closing, but this one—" He positioned the test light and touched the probe to a specific point. The light flickered. "This one is cycling, not failing completely, just cycling, inconsistently, which would give you an intermittent signal that reads as a different fault every time you test it, depending on exactly when in the cycle your diagnostic equipment is taking its reading." The room was quiet. Mason put the test light down and reached into the toolbox again. He came up with a relay puller and a small can of electrical contact cleaner. He removed the relay from its socket with a careful, practiced motion, sprayed both the relay contacts and the socket contacts with the cleaner, waited 10 seconds with the kind of patience that suggested he'd done this before without being in any hurry, and seated the relay back in its socket. Then he looked at the ground strap situation at the rear chassis connection that he'd mentioned outside. The strap itself was original. Braided metal, now with significant surface oxidation concentrated at the connection point. He produced a wire brush from the toolbox and carefully worked the connection point until the oxidation gave way to clean metal, then applied a thin coat of electrical grease from a small tube. The whole process took about 7 minutes. He stepped back, picked up his toolbox, and looked at Evelyn. "You want to try it, Mum?" Nobody moved for a moment. Then one of the Meridian engineers said very quietly, "It's not going to be that simple." Mason didn't respond to that. He looked at Evelyn. She walked past everyone, past Preston and Dietrich and the journalists and her own executive team, and opened the driver's side door and got in. She sat in the seat that her grandfather had sat in. The leather was cold from the climate-controlled air. She put her hands on the wheel, which was original Nardi, thin and elegant and slightly smaller in diameter than modern wheels. She could feel the ridges of it against her palms. She looked at the key in the ignition. It was a simple key, old-fashioned, with a small oval head. She reached out and turned it to the first position. The instruments lit up. That part had always worked. The battery was modern, one of the few non-original components anyone had touched, and the basic electrical systems had always responded. That wasn't the problem. The problem was what happened when you turned the key the rest of the way. She turned it. The engine turned over. And then, with a sound that traveled up through the chassis, through the seat, through the wheel, and into her hands, it caught. The Ferrari started. The V12 came to life with a sound that was nothing like any modern engine sound. It was deeper and rawer, and somehow more alive than that. A sound with texture to it, with harmonics, with the particular roughness of a hand-built thing that had been dormant for 20 years, and was now shaking off that dormancy with what could only be described as eagerness. It was loud in the enclosed space. It was not a gentle sound. It was not trying to be refined or smooth or polished. It was simply, immediately, itself. Evelyn sat very still with her hands on the wheel and the engine vibrating through everything around her, and felt something happen in her chest that she was not prepared for. She had spent 3 years and an amount of money she had never totaled because totaling it would have been too depressing, believing that this moment might happen, telling herself it would happen, refusing to accept the possibility that it wouldn't. And now it was happening and she wasn't ready for it anyway. Her eyes filled with tears. She blinked. They came back. She heard nothing outside the car for a moment, just the engine, the beautiful and chaotic voice of the engine, the sound her grandfather had described to her once as the sound of something that had decided to be alive. She sat there for what was probably 30 seconds and felt like longer. Then she turned the engine off and got out. The room outside the car was different than it had been. Preston was standing very still, his arms at his sides now instead of crossed. Dietrich had both hands pressed together in front of his face, fingertips touching his lips, not quite hiding an expression that moved through several things quickly. The journalists had their cameras out and were recording. One of them, a woman who had been covering automotive stories for 15 years and had interviewed CEOs and racing champions and factory directors, was watching Mason with an expression that she probably would have preferred to keep off her face. "How did you see that?" she said. She wasn't recording herself when she said it. It was a genuine question, not an interview question. Mason was closing his toolbox. The latches made a small, definitive click. "The diagnostic reports your team filed are online," he said, speaking to Dietrich. "I read them this morning. The pattern in your data, the way the fault shifted every time you tested. It's a fingerprint for an intermittent relay, and a cycling ground issue will move your fault signature every time the temperature changes in the bay. You'd have been chasing a different ghost every day." He straightened up. "I'm not saying your team missed something obvious. The relay was in an awkward spot, and the rear ground strap issue was subtle. The corrosion was underneath the connection sleeve, not visible from above." Dietrich lowered his hands. His expression had settled into something honest. "You read our diagnostic reports." "This morning," Mason said. "They were thorough, good detail." "You read them this morning and came here." "Seemed worth trying," Mason said. Preston opened his mouth and then closed it again. He looked at the Ferrari. He looked at Mason. Something moved across his face that he appeared to choose not to voice. Evelyn was standing a few feet from Mason, close enough to see that his expression hadn't changed. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look like a man who had just proven something. He looked like someone who had done a job and was waiting to see if there was anything else needed. The toolbox was in his hand. He was ready to leave if that was what came next. "Why did you come?" she said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. He looked at her. His eyes were a shade of brown that was close to dark amber, and they were level and direct without being aggressive about it. "I grew up around old cars," he said. "Cars from this era. I have a feeling for the way the electrical systems in them fail. I read about the Ferrari, about your grandfather, and what you've been trying to do, and I thought I might be able to help." "Just like that," she said. "My shop is about 20 minutes from here," he said. "It wasn't a big trip." She looked at him for another moment. "Do you know how much money has been spent on this car?" He appeared to think about whether to answer that directly. "I have a general idea." "And you fixed it in less than 10 minutes." The car wasn't complicated to fix, he said. It was just complicated to find. Those are two different problems. The journalists got their story. They couldn't help it. A Ferrari that had defeated the best experts in the world, started by a mechanic from a small garage with a toolbox and a test light, with tears rolling down the face of one of the most powerful women in the automotive industry. It was too clean a story to ignore, even if the clean version of it missed most of what had actually happened in that room. The story ran the next morning on 3 automotive publications, and by afternoon had been picked up by mainstream outlets. The details shifted in the retelling the way they always do. Mason became younger in some versions and older in others, the time frame compressed from minutes to seconds in the headlines. The Ferrari's value inflated to figures that even Evelyn would have found flattering. But the core of it stayed consistent. An ordinary man had done what extraordinary resources could not. Mason wasn't there for any of it. By the time the first camera crew arrived at Sterling Automotive's headquarters looking for him, he was back in his shop in Bridgeport, on the south side of Chicago, changing the brake pads on a 2009 Honda Civic for a woman named Dolores, who taught elementary school and couldn't afford the dealership prices, and who needed the car working by Thursday because Thursday was when she drove her mother to dialysis. He finished the brake job, wiped down the rotor, and then stood in the open bay door of his shop for a while, looking out at the street. It was getting dark. The temperature had dropped another few degrees. Across the street, a Dominican restaurant was putting on its evening lights, and the smell of roasting meat drifted over. He had to pick up his daughter from the Hernandez family's house by 6. She had been there since school let out. Mrs. Hernandez had insisted it was no trouble, which Mason believed, because nothing seemed to be too much trouble for Mrs. Hernandez, who was in her 60s and had raised 4 children and treated everyone on the block like an honorary 5th. He checked his watch, 5:45. He locked up the shop and got into his truck. The truck was a 2004 Ford F-15. Dark green, with 180,000 miles on it, and a slightly misaligned front end that he'd been meaning to correct for 2 months and kept not getting to because other people's cars needed attention first. It started on the first turn, as it always did, because Mason was constitutionally incapable of tolerating a vehicle that didn't run reliably, even his own. He drove through the neighborhood thinking about the Ferrari, not about the accomplishment of it, about the car itself, the engine, the sound of it catching, the harmonics in that first rough idle. He had heard a lot of engines start over his lifetime, including some famous ones in various states of repair, and that engine was something specific. There was a reason his grandfather Harlan had commissioned it. There was a reason it had been built the way it was built. He thought about the woman, Evelyn Sterling. He had known who she was before he walked into that building. The Sterling name was not obscure in automotive circles. He had expected someone corporate, someone managed, someone who communicated primarily through PR and professional distance. What he had found was a woman standing at a window holding a cold cup of coffee and looking at a car the way you look at something you've been unable to stop thinking about for a long time. He pulled up in front of the Hernandez house and honked once. The front door opened and his daughter came out in her winter coat, her backpack bouncing on one shoulder, running down the porch steps with the specific confidence of a child who has never yet had a reason to doubt that the world will be there to catch her. Her name was Lily. She was 8 years old, and she had her mother's eyes. "Dad," she said, climbing into the truck and pulling the door shut behind her with both hands. "Mrs. Hernandez made tamales. She gave me some for you. They're in my bag. Also, I learned how to say 17 words in Spanish today. Do you want to hear them?" "Yeah," Mason said. "I want to hear all 17. She started reciting them before he had finished pulling away from the curb. The truck moved through the darkening streets of Bridgeport, past the restaurants and the barbershops and the hardware stores, past the elementary school where the flag was snapping in the cold wind, past the park where the swing set stood empty in the early evening. Mason listened to his daughter's Spanish vocabulary and drove home, and the Ferrari, and the room full of stunned faces, and the sound of an engine waking up after 20 years of silence, receded slowly into the back of his mind. Not gone, not forgotten, but put away for now. In the particular way he had learned to put things away since the night 4 years ago, when the world had cracked open and never quite closed back up the same. One day at a time. Tonight, there were tamales. What Mason didn't know, as he turned the truck into his block and saw the lit windows of his apartment above the hardware store on Paulina Street was that Evelyn Sterling was at that same moment sitting in the back of a car service on Lakeshore Drive, looking at his name on her phone screen. Not his phone number. His name. She hadn't looked up his number yet. She was still deciding something. She had been deciding it since the moment he picked up his toolbox and said seemed worth trying without a trace of performance in his voice. She had spent her adult life in rooms full of people who were constantly, exhaustingly performing. Performing competence, performing confidence, performing loyalty to her or to her grandfather's legacy or to whatever they needed to appear loyal to in the moment. She had learned to read the performance versus the real thing the way some people learn to read weather, not infallibly, but with a pattern recognition that came from years of exposure. Mason Ryder had not been performing anything. That, more than the Ferrari starting, was what she kept coming back to. She put her phone in her bag and looked out the window at the lake, which was black and restless in the November dark, and thought about her grandfather, who had spent the last years of his life trying to explain to her that the most important thing in business, and in everything, was the ability to recognize when you were looking at something real. "You'll know it," he had told her once, when she was maybe 17 and impatient and convinced that most of what he said was the kind of thing old men said when they wanted to sound wise. "You'll know it because it won't be trying to convince you of anything. Real things don't need to convince you. They just are." She had not thought about that particular piece of advice in years. She was thinking about it now. The car moved along the lakeshore in the dark, and the city moved with it. And somewhere in Bridgeport, a truck pulled into a parking spot, and a little girl carried tamales up a flight of stairs. And in the restoration bay of a building on the 42nd floor, of which decisions were made that moved significant amounts of money in significant directions, a red Ferrari sat with its engine warm for the first time in 20 years, ticking quietly in the way that engines do when they have recently been running and are cooling back down to stillness. Ticking like a clock. Ticking like a heart. Ticking like something that has, against considerable odds, decided to keep going. The tamales were still warm when Mason got them out of Lily's backpack, and she sat across from him at the kitchen table and watched him eat with the focused attention of someone who has opinions about whether the food is being properly appreciated. "Mrs. Hernandez said you have to reheat them in a pan, not the microwave," Lily said. She was very serious about that. "I know," Mason said. He had eaten them cold standing at the counter. "Dad, they were good cold." "That's not the point." She pulled her knees up onto her chair, which she knew she wasn't supposed to do, but which he rarely had the energy to enforce after 6 in the evening. "Mrs. Hernandez has feelings about her tamales. Mrs. Hernandez has feelings about everything. That's because she cares about things." Lily said this with the particular authority of an 8-year-old who has recently discovered that caring about things is a virtue and intends to deploy this discovery as needed. "Do you want to hear the Spanish words now?" "Hit me." She went through them. 17 words, mostly accurate, with a pronunciation on Mariposa that needed some work but showed genuine effort. Mason listened and corrected twice and let the rest go, because there was a difference between teaching and discouraging, and he had learned that difference in the hard way that most parenting lessons arrived, too late to undo the mistake that taught it. After Lily went to bed, he sat at the table for a while with a cup of coffee and his phone. There were 4 missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize, and 2 texts from his friend Cobb, who ran an auto parts supply 2 blocks over and apparently had seen the story online. "Bro. BRO. Is this you? The Ferrari thing?" And then 20 minutes later, "Call me when you get a chance. Also, I told everyone it was you, so if you were planning to be private about this, that window has passed. Sorry, not sorry." Mason set the phone face down on the table. He finished his coffee. He washed the cup. He stood at the kitchen window for a minute, looking out at the alley behind the building, where the sodium light made everything the color of old photographs. And then he went to bed. He slept badly, which was not unusual. Sleep had been a complicated thing since Claire died. In the early months after, it had been nearly impossible. He would lie in the dark and his brain would simply refuse to stop, cycling through a loop of images and conversations, and the particular specific memory of the hospital room at 4 in the morning, the machines, the sound of her breathing changing in a way that the nurse had warned him about, and that he had not been ready to hear anyway. That had eventually softened the way grief softens, not by getting smaller, but by becoming familiar, something you carry rather than something that pins you in place. Now, sleep mostly came. It just came with interruptions, with a brain that surfaced at 2 or 3 in the morning and required conscious effort to settle back down. He lay in the dark that night and thought about the Ferrari and about Evelyn Sterling's face when the engine started, and about the specific sound of that V12 in that enclosed space, the harmonics of it, the way the vibration had traveled through the floor into his shoes, and how it had felt like something waking up that had deserved to be awake. He thought about Claire, the way she used to wake up before him, the specific sound of her moving quietly in the kitchen, trying not to disturb him, which never worked because he had always been a light sleeper, and which he had never told her didn't work because she was trying so hard to be considerate, and he loved that about her even when it was 4 in the morning. He thought about Lily's Spanish words. Eventually, sometime around 2, he slept. His alarm went off at 5:30 and he got up. The shop opened at 7. By 6:50, he had the space heater running in the bay, the coffee going in the back office, and the scheduling board checked. Tuesday was a full day. An oil change and tire rotation on a Subaru Forester for a regular named Gerald Watkins, who had been coming to him since Mason first opened the shop 3 years ago. A fuel pump replacement on a 2007 Dodge minivan for a woman named Patricia, who had called twice the previous week to make sure he hadn't forgotten, and an afternoon appointment that had come in overnight online. Someone who had booked through the website without calling, which was unusual, and left only a first name in the booking form. Evelyn. 2 p.m. Vehicle, personal. Query, consultation. Mason read this twice. Then he went and got his coffee. The morning went the way mornings usually went. Gerald came in at 7:15 and talked for the better part of 40 minutes about the Bears' offensive line while Mason worked the lift, and Mason listened and contributed enough to keep the conversation moving without having to think about it much, because sports served a specific social function in this neighborhood, and he had learned to speak it fluently even when he didn't particularly care about the subject. Patricia's minivan required an hour and a half because the fuel pump housing had corroded slightly around the mounting ring and required some persuasion before it released, and Patricia herself arrived while he was finishing up and stood in the bay with her arms crossed and a look on her face that Mason recognized as the look of someone who has been calculating repair costs against rent and found the math uncomfortable. "What do I owe you?" she said. He had priced the job at cost plus a modest labor rate, as he did for most of his customers. He told her the number. She nodded the way people nod when a number is better than they expected, but they don't want to seem relieved because relief implies they'd been worried, and they prefer to appear in control of their financial situation. "Okay," she said, "that's okay. Pump should be good for another 100,000 miles, Mason said. The housing had some surface corrosion, but nothing structural. You're fine." "It's a good van," she said, with the particular affection people reserve for vehicles they have driven long enough to feel like members of the household. "My daughter was born the year I bought it." "How old is she now?" 14. Patricia made a face that combined pride and bewilderment in equal measure. 14 and she knows everything about everything. 8 here, Mason said. "I'm told it gets worse." "It gets different," Patricia said. "Different is its own thing." She paid and left, and Mason had about 40 minutes before the 2 o'clock appointment, which he spent cleaning up the bay and eating a sandwich from the place across the street and not looking at his phone, which had accumulated 17 missed calls and a text from a number he recognized as the main Sterling Automotive corporate line. He looked at the text from the Sterling number. It said, "Ms. Sterling would like to speak with you at your earliest convenience. This is Marcus Chen, EA to Ms. Sterling. You can reach me at..." and then a direct number. He put the phone back in his pocket. At 1:58, a black car service vehicle pulled up in front of the shop. Not a limousine, a regular black sedan, the kind that corporate accounts used for airport runs. It idled for a moment, and then Evelyn Sterling got out. She was dressed differently than she had been the previous day. Less formal, which in practice meant a dark coat over what appeared to be a regular sweater and trousers, hair pulled back in a way that seemed less arranged than the day before, slightly hurried. She was not accompanied by anyone. No Marcus, No security, no PR person. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment looking at the facade of the shop. The sign that read Ryder Automotive in faded black letters on a white background, the bay door open, the smell of motor oil and cold air coming out, with an expression that was hard to read from where Mason was standing inside. Then she walked in. "You didn't return Marcus's call," she said, by way of opening. "No," Mason said, "or any of the other calls. I had a busy morning." She looked around the shop with the particular attention of someone trying to understand a place without asking about it directly. It was a functional space, 2 bays, 1 lift, shelving units along the back wall with parts and fluids organized in a system that made sense to Mason, and probably to no one else. A hand-painted board near the office door listing current jobs. The concrete floor was stained in the permanent way of a space that had been a working garage for decades before Mason took over the lease. There was a child's drawing tacked to the wall above the scheduling board. Lily's, from about a year ago, a figure that was approximately a car with wheels that defied the basic laws of wheel placement. "Nice drawing," Evelyn said. "My daughter's." "How old?" 8. She looked at it for another moment. She put 6 wheels on it. She said 4 wasn't enough. She wanted to be sure it didn't fall over. Something moved briefly across Evelyn's face. Not quite a smile, not quite not. She turned to face him. "Can we talk?" "That's what you booked the appointment for." "I booked a consultation. I wasn't sure you'd take a regular appointment from me." "I take appointments from everyone," Mason said. He pulled the rolling stool from the corner and sat on it, which put him at an informal angle that was probably not what she expected from someone she'd come to talk business with. But the stool was where he sat, and he saw no reason to perform a different posture. "What did you want to talk about?" Evelyn stood rather than look for somewhere to sit, which he got the impression was her default. She was a person who thought more clearly on her feet. She put her hands in her coat pockets. "Where did you learn to work on cars like that?" she said. "My uncle had a shop when I was growing up," Mason said. "I started working in it when I was 9, and then I raced." "Raced?" "Regional circuits, mostly. Some national series, nothing you'd have heard of unless you follow that specific world." He paused. "I was decent." "Decent," she said, with the tone of someone who suspects the word is doing significant understating. "I was good," he said, "for a while." He said it without particular pride or regret, the way you state a fact about a period of your life that is closed. Evelyn looked at him steadily, waiting to see if there was more. He didn't offer more. "Why did you stop?" she asked. "My wife got sick." He said it the way he had learned to say it, directly, without softening the sentence into something more comfortable, because softening it tended to make the other person focus on managing their reaction rather than hearing what was actually being said. "She was diagnosed with a brain tumor when our daughter was 3. I stopped racing to be home. She died about 14 months after the diagnosis." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "Thank you," he said. The way he said it made clear that he meant it and that he didn't need her to say anything else about it. She seemed to understand that. "So you opened this," she said. "I needed work I could do here, work where I could pick up Lily from school." He glanced at the scheduling board. "I like fixing things. I'm good at it. And the neighborhood needed a shop that didn't charge dealership rates." "You charge under market," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I charge what people can pay. That's not a sustainable business model. I get by," he said. It was not entirely true and not entirely false. He got by in the sense of covering rent and keeping the lights on and putting food in the refrigerator and taking Lily to the dentist. He did not get by in the sense of having a financial cushion or a retirement account or the ability to absorb an unexpected large expense without it becoming a serious problem. He had chosen this arrangement deliberately and continued to choose it each month when the books came up thin. "What did you actually come here to ask me?" She was quiet for a moment, assembling something. He got the impression she had come in with a prepared version of this conversation and was now revising it. "I want to know if you'd be willing to consult on some of our other restoration projects," she said. "Sterling Automotive has a collection. My grandfather's personal vehicles, some historic racing cars, a few acquisitions. Some of them have been sitting in the same state as the Ferrari. Problems that haven't been resolved. She paused. I'd pay you properly. What does properly mean? She named a figure for a consulting engagement. It was the kind of number that would have made most people in Mason's position stop breathing for a moment. He absorbed it without any visible change in expression, which seemed to briefly unsettle her. That's a lot of money, he said. The cars represent significantly more. I know what the cars represent. He looked at the wall for a moment, thinking. I have a shop. I have a schedule. I have a kid who needs to be picked up at 3:15 every day. The consulting work would be on your schedule, she said. Not mine. You could fit it around the shop. And if I can't fix what your team couldn't fix? Then you can't, she said. I'm not asking for guarantees. I'm asking for a different perspective. She met his eyes. You looked at a diagnostic report that a dozen engineers had read, and you saw something none of them saw. That's not a small thing. I got lucky with the Ferrari, he said, though he said it in a tone that suggested he didn't entirely believe that. No, you didn't. She said it with a flatness that was almost argumentative. I've spent 3 years watching people approach that car with everything except patience. You took 10 minutes and looked at what was actually there instead of what should have been there. That's not luck. That's a different way of thinking. Mason was quiet. He was looking at the lily drawing on the wall. There was something in the conversation that was making him uncomfortable in a way he was trying to identify. Not Evelyn herself. She was direct in a way he respected, and the discomfort was not the discomfort of distrust. It was something else. The door that the offer was opening, maybe. The version of his life that it suggested was possible, that he had spent 4 years carefully not looking at directly. He had been good at racing. Before Claire got sick, he had been on the edge of something real. A team had been interested, a serious team with National Series money and a genuine development program. He had been 26. He had walked away from the conversation without quite making a decision, and then the diagnosis had arrived, and the decision had been made for him by circumstances, and he had told himself that was fine, that it was the right thing, that he did not regret it. He did not regret it. That was the honest truth. He would make the same choice again in every version of the story where he was the same person. But there was a difference between not regretting a choice and pretending the door didn't exist. He had developed a habit of not looking at doors. Let me think about it, he said. Of course, she said. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a business card, actual paper, which surprised him, and set it on the workbench beside him. That's my direct number, not Marcus, not the corporate line, mine. She looked at him. I came here myself because I wanted to see where you work, where you actually work. I've been in a lot of meetings in the last 3 years with people who told me they could fix that car, and not one of them ever made me feel like they were showing me something honest about themselves. She paused. You did. Yesterday. Without trying to. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. She picked up her coat's collar against the cold air coming in from the open bay door. Think about it, she said. There's no deadline. She walked out. The black car was still waiting. He watched it pull away and then looked at the business card on the workbench. His phone buzzed. It was Cobb. You're literally on CNN. I hope you're having a day. Mason turned the business card over. On the back, in handwriting that was slightly more personal than he expected from someone with an executive assistant, it said, The Ferrari sounds incredible. Thank you. He put the card in his shirt pocket. He had 2 more jobs to do before 3:15. He went back to work. The thing about working with your hands, the specific kind of work that was almost entirely physical and diagnostic, where the problem lived in a physical object and the solution required touching the object and listening to it, and sometimes just holding a component and feeling whether it was right, was that it occupied the conscious mind just enough to let the rest of the brain run in the background without interruption. Mason had discovered this when he was 9 years old in his Uncle Roy's shop and had never found a reason to update the finding. Some of his clearest thinking happened while he was elbow deep in an engine bay with a diagnostic light in his teeth. He thought about Claire. He thought about her the way he often thought about her while he was working. Not with pain exactly, not anymore, but with the particular quality of missing someone who was deeply woven into the fabric of your understanding of yourself. Claire had been the one who pushed, not in an aggressive way, not demanding or pressuring, but in the way of someone who genuinely believed in you more consistently than you believed in yourself, and found ways to make that clear without making it into a performance. She had been the one who told him to call the team back, 4 years before she got sick. When the development program had reached out, he had been wavering, coming up with reasons why it was risky, why the timing wasn't right, why there were things he needed to handle first. She had put both hands on his face and looked at him and said, "Mason, call them back. You can handle things from a racetrack just as well as you can handle them from a living room." He had called. They had been interested. And then 6 months later, her head started hurting in a new way, and the MRI showed what it showed. And the conversation with the team quietly ceased to be relevant. He had never told her that the conversation had been ongoing when she got the diagnosis. She'd been carrying enough. He carried that particular piece himself, which was fine. He was used to carrying things. After Claire died, he had needed to do something. The grief didn't care about timing or practicality, but Lily needed feeding, and the rent existed, and the bottom of the particular well he'd fallen into was not a place he could afford to stay in indefinitely. Opening the shop had been practical more than anything. He knew the work. He knew he could do it without the kind of mental overhead that an office job would have required in that first year. And there was something about fixing broken things when the most important thing in his life had been unfixable, that he couldn't entirely explain, but that had mattered more than he would have told anyone. He had not expected to find that he loved it. Not the business of it. The business of it was genuinely difficult and occasionally demoralizing, doing the math at the end of each month with a yellow legal pad and trying to find margin that wasn't there. But the work itself, the specific act of taking something that wasn't functioning and understanding why, and fixing it, and giving it back to the person it belonged to so that their life could proceed the way they needed it to proceed. Patricia's minivan, Gerald's Subaru, the dozen other regulars he had accumulated over 3 years, people from the neighborhood who came back not just because his prices were fair, but because he remembered what they drove and how they drove it, and what they'd told him was wrong last time. And because when he said something was fine, they believed him. He picked up Lily at 3:15. She had paint on her left hand from an art project and a very important opinion about what they should have for dinner. "Pasta," she said, with the certainty of a judge reading a verdict. "We had pasta Monday." "Pasta is timeless, Dad." "What kind of pasta?" She thought about this with genuine seriousness. "The kind with the stuff in it. That describes most pasta." "The good stuff," she said firmly. "You know the one." He did know the one. He made it while she did homework at the kitchen table, occasionally interrupting with questions that ranged from reasonable, what's 7 times 8, to surreal. If a cloud weighed something, how would you weigh it? And he answered all of them with roughly equal attention, because the surreal ones were often more interesting. After dinner, after Lily was asleep, Mason took the business card out of his shirt pocket and put it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while. He was not a person who made decisions quickly, which people who didn't know him sometimes mistook for passivity. It wasn't passivity. It was the habit of someone who had learned the hard way that the first feeling about a thing and the right decision about a thing were not always the same event, and that giving them time to separate was usually worth the wait. The offer was real money, real enough to stop doing the monthly math on a yellow legal pad for a while, real enough to fix Lily's bedroom window that had been sticking since September, real enough to do something about the truck's alignment, but that wasn't really what he was thinking about. He was thinking about the Ferrari's engine, the sound of it, the way Evelyn Sterling had sat in the driver's seat with tears running down her face and her hands on the original Nardi wheel, and how she had not tried to hide the tears or perform her composure. She had just sat there and felt what she was feeling in front of a room full of people who were watching her. He had respected that without quite meaning to. He turned the card over. The handwriting on the back was slightly uneven, like it had been written quickly, in the car maybe, or standing up. "The Ferrari sounds incredible. Thank you." Not thank you for the work, or thank you for your help, or any of the more formal versions of gratitude that people in her position usually deployed. Just thank you, plain, the way you'd say it to a person rather than to a service. His phone buzzed. Unknown number, Chicago area code. He almost didn't answer. Then he did. "Mason Ryder," he said. "Mr. Ryder." A man's voice, older, slightly raspy in the way of someone who had spent decades on shop floors in spaces that weren't ventilated quite well enough. "My name is Frank DeLuca. I'm calling because I saw the story about you and the Ferrari. I'm the foreman at a restoration facility in Cicero. We've had a car in our shop for 11 months that nobody can crack. Owner's getting impatient. I'm getting embarrassed." A pause. "Would you be willing to come take a look?" "What kind of car?" Mason said. 1957 Maserati 250F, full race configuration, original engine, original transmission. The problem is in the fuel delivery system somewhere, and I have run out of places to look. Mason was quiet for a moment. A 1957 Maserati 250F in original race configuration was a car that had no business being anything other than in a museum. And the fact that it was in a shop in Cicero and someone's foreman was calling a mechanic from a neighborhood garage at 8 in the evening told its own story. "Send me what you have on it," he said. "Diagnostic logs, maintenance records, whatever you've got. I'll look at it." Yeah, okay, I can do that. What's your email?" Mason gave it to him. He sat at the table after the call ended, the business card in his hand, and thought about the particular quality of silence in a car that is about to start. The moment between turning the key and hearing the answer, when anything is still possible. He had not thought about that in years. Racing had been about that moment, partly. The moment before. He had been living in the after for a long time. He put the business card in the kitchen junk drawer, which was where important things went in his apartment when they needed to exist, but he wasn't ready to look at them. He went to bed. He did not sleep well, but he slept. In the morning, there was an email from Frank DeLuca with 3 attachments and a subject line that read, "The Maserati. Please don't give up on it." And another from an address he didn't recognize, no subject line, body reading only. "The Ferrari ran for 40 minutes yesterday. It was the best 40 minutes I've had in a long time." E. Mason read both emails twice. Then he got Lily up for school, made her eggs because she had changed her position on breakfast since Monday, listened to her talk about a disagreement with her friend Kezia about the correct pronunciation of a word that neither of them had actually looked up in a dictionary, and drove her to school. Coming back through the neighborhood, he took a slightly longer route, past the park, past the elementary school's painted mural that the 3rd grade had done last spring, sunflowers and animals, and one surprisingly sophisticated rendering of a city skyline that the art teacher had apparently been very proud of. The city in the early morning had the quality it always had in winter, stripped down and honest, the trees bare, the light flat and clear, everything exactly what it was without the softening effect of leaves or the distraction of summer weather. He thought about Evelyn's email. The best 40 minutes I've had in a long time. He thought about what it meant to be the person who gave someone that. Not the money version of it, not the transaction, the thing underneath it, the sound of something coming back to life that had been silent too long. He pulled up in front of the shop. He sat in the truck for a moment before going in, hands on the wheel, looking at the sign. Ryder Automotive in faded black letters. The bay door needed a new coat of paint on the lower edge where the weather had gotten to it. He had been meaning to do that for a year. He got out. He unlocked the shop. He turned on the lights and the space heater and started the coffee and took out his phone and opened the email from Frank DeLuca and began reading about a Maserati that nobody could fix. By the time the coffee was ready, he had a theory. The Maserati was in worse shape than the email had suggested, which Mason had suspected before he even drove to Cicero. Frank DeLuca's diagnostic logs were thorough in the way that experienced mechanics were thorough, detailed, methodical, covering every obvious avenue. And that was precisely the problem. When someone had been thorough about all the obvious things, and the car still wasn't running, the fault was almost always somewhere that thoroughness hadn't reached yet. Not because the mechanic was careless, because there were places in old machines where careful people stopped looking, either out of habit or out of a reasonable assumption that certain components simply didn't fail in certain ways. Mason drove to the facility in Cicero on a Thursday morning, leaving the shop in the hands of a part-time helper named Darnell, who was 19 and reliable in the specific way of someone who is trying to prove something and hasn't yet had enough time for complacency to set in. He told Darnell to call if anything complicated came in, and not to quote prices on anything he wasn't sure about, and Darnell said yes to both with the slightly excessive agreement of someone who wanted the responsibility and was nervous about it. The facility in Cicero was larger than Mason's shop by a significant margin. A converted industrial space with 6 bays, good lighting, proper ventilation, equipment that had cost real money. Frank DeLuca was waiting outside when Mason pulled up. He was in his late 50s, heavy-set, with the kind of forearms that came from a lifetime of physical work, and a face that had been weathered by years of squinting at things in inadequate light. He shook Mason's hand with the grip of someone who measured people partly through that act and was paying attention to what it told him. "Appreciate you coming," Frank said. He said it simply, without the particular inflection people used when they were trying to communicate that appreciating something was difficult for them. It was just true, and he said it. "Let me see it," Mason said. The Maserati 250F was in the 3rd bay, under a bank of overhead lights that made it look like something on a stage, which in a sense it was. A car that had been built to exist in front of crowds, on circuits, in the specific theater of mid-century Grand Prix racing, a machine whose purpose had been velocity and precision and the particular human decision to take something moving that fast and push it faster. It was smaller than modern race cars, lower and narrower, with a body shape that looked almost organic, curved in ways that suggested wind rather than engineering, though engineering was precisely what it was. The red paint was original and had the depth that original paint from that era developed over decades. Not the flat perfection of a respray, but something with history in it. Mason crouched beside it the same way he had crouched beside the Ferrari. He looked at it from below. He walked around it slowly. He did not open the hood for 4 minutes, and Frank, to his credit, did not fill those 4 minutes with explanation or question. He just stood back and let the looking happen. "Tell me what you've tried," Mason said, still looking at the car. Frank told him. It took about 12 minutes and was comprehensive. The fuel delivery problem had manifested as an inability to maintain consistent fuel pressure at anything above idle. The car would start, run roughly at low revs, and cut out entirely under acceleration. They had replaced the fuel pump. They had rebuilt the carburetors. They had checked the fuel lines for blockage, checked the tank for contamination, replaced the fuel filter, examined the mechanical fuel pressure regulator. Nothing had changed the behavior of the fault. "What about the pressure relief valve on the regulator?" Mason said. Frank stopped. "The relief valve is internal to the regulator. We replaced the whole unit." "With a period-correct unit or a reproduction?" A short pause. "Reproduction. The original was cracked." "Where'd you source it?" Frank named a supplier. Mason nodded slowly, not because he was satisfied but because he was thinking. He opened the hood. The engine was right there. A straight 6 2.5 liters, with 6 individual Weber carburetors in a row that were one of the most visually striking things in vintage motorsport, each carburetor with its own velocity stack. The whole assembly looking more like an instrument than a mechanical component. Mason leaned in and looked at the reproduction fuel pressure regulator that had been fitted in place of the cracked original. He looked at it for a while without touching it. Then he reached into his toolbox, which he had brought from the truck, as he always did because he did not work with borrowed tools, and produced a fuel pressure gauge with a long hose. He connected the gauge to the system and asked Frank to run the fuel pump manually for 30 seconds. The gauge showed pressure building, correct pressure, within spec, holding steady at idle. "Now blip the throttle," Mason said. Frank reached in and worked the throttle linkage by hand. The pressure on the gauge dropped sharply, recovered, dropped again. "Again," Mason said. Same result. Mason looked at the regulator. He looked at the gauge. He looked at the line running from the regulator back to the fuel tank. He traced the line with his fingers to where it connected at a junction beneath the firewall, and he stopped. "This return line," he said. "Was this replaced when you put in the new regulator?" Frank looked. The line was flushed and pressure tested. Flushed and tested at what pressure? Standard shop pressure, around 40 psi. The return line on this system would see pressure spikes above that under hard acceleration, Mason said. He kept his voice even, not accusatory. This was not a mistake born of carelessness. It was a mistake born of reasonable assumptions. The line itself looks original. You've got a return line that's 60-plus years old, and when the system pressure spikes, the line is collapsing internally. The outside looks fine. Internally, the rubber has deteriorated to the point where it closes under pressure instead of staying open. Fuel can't return to the tank. Pressure builds past what the regulator can handle. System cuts out. Frank was very still. He looked at the line. He was a man with 30 years in this work, and the expression on his face was not the expression of someone who had been shown up. It was the expression of someone who had been shown something true that they had missed, and who was honest enough with himself to accept it as both of those things at once. "The outside of the line looks completely fine," Frank said. "They always do," Mason said. "Internal rubber deterioration doesn't show on the outside until it's collapsed completely. You'd need to cut it open to see it." "We pressure tested it. At 40 psi, it probably held," Mason said. "At 60, 70. At the pressures you'd see under acceleration, it would have been borderline. At 90, it closes." Frank put both hands on the edge of the engine bay and leaned on them for a moment, looking at the line. He breathed out through his nose. "I've been looking at this car for 11 months, he said. "I know," Mason said, "and it was a rubber line." "It was a rubber line," Mason said. Not cruelly, just honestly. Frank was quiet for another moment. Then he straightened up and said, "I need to source a period-correct replacement. The line spec on these is specific." "I know a supplier in Ohio who carries them," Mason said. "I'll send you the contact." Frank looked at him. There was something in his face that was working through something. Not quite gratitude, not quite professional assessment, but something that contained elements of both, and also something more personal. The thing that happens between two people who work with their hands and recognize something in each other without being able to say precisely what it is. "You want coffee?" Frank said. "Yeah," Mason said. "I'll take coffee." They sat in Frank's cramped back office for 40 minutes, and Mason did not talk about the Ferrari or the news coverage. And Frank did not bring it up, and they talked about old cars and the particular challenges of sourcing period-correct components, and a shop in Gary that Frank knew about that had a warehouse full of original Italian sports car parts from the 50s and 60s that the owner was slowly and reluctantly making available as he got older and started to understand that a warehouse full of irreplaceable parts was going to outlast his ability to manage them. Mason drove back to Bridgeport with the windows cracked despite the cold, thinking. The calls had not stopped. They had, if anything, intensified over the past week. More missed numbers, more texts from Cobb, and from people he hadn't spoken to in years. 2 voicemails from automotive journalists who had somehow obtained his personal number, and an email from a luxury car manufacturer in Germany whose name he recognized from racing that had been forwarded through 3 intermediaries before reaching him. The journey of the email itself suggesting a corporate entity that was not accustomed to not having direct access to the people it wanted to speak with. He had not responded to most of it. He had answered Frank DeLuca's call because Frank had sounded like a mechanic talking to another mechanic, and because an original Maserati 250F deserved to run. He had answered 2 other calls from smaller shops with similar problems. An Austin Healey with an electrical fault that nobody could locate. A Porsche 356 with a gearbox issue that had stumped 3 separate specialists and had spent time on each of them, either talking through diagnostics by phone or visiting in person, and in each case had found something that was findable if you approached it from a particular direction. He had not yet called Evelyn back, though her email sat in his inbox where he looked at it roughly every other day. What stopped him was not reluctance about the work. It was something harder to name. Something about the scale of what was being suggested, the distance between the life he had built and the life that responding to that email seemed to point toward, and the particular fear, not dramatic, not operatic, just a quiet, persistent thing, that he was not the person who belonged in that other life, and that finding that out after stepping into it would cost more than he could afford to lose. He picked up Lily. She had a permission slip for a field trip that she thrust at him the moment she got in the truck with the urgency of someone who has been waiting to deliver a critical document. "It's the Natural History Museum," she said. "Kazia went last year, and she said the dinosaurs are very big. Dinosaurs are generally big. That's the nature of dinosaurs." "These are bigger," Lily said, with the authority of someone reporting second-hand witness testimony. "Also, there's a whole thing about rocks." "A whole thing about rocks," Mason said. "Minerals," she corrected herself. Kezia said minerals, not rocks. There's a difference, apparently. There is a difference, Mason said. Do you know the difference? Yeah. Tell me. He explained the difference between rocks and minerals for the rest of the drive home, and Lily listened with the specific attention she gave to things she had decided were worth knowing, which was a quality he had noticed in her early and which reminded him of Claire so strongly sometimes that it required a moment to absorb. That night, after she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table and opened Evelyn's email again and read it again. The Ferrari ran for 40 minutes yesterday. It was the best 40 minutes I've had in a long time. He typed back. Glad to hear it. The Maserati in Cicero is a collapsed internal return line. Thought you'd want to know I've been keeping busy. He almost deleted the second sentence. He sent it with the second sentence. Her response came back in 11 minutes, which, given that it was past 9 in the evening, told him something about her working habits. I heard about the Maserati. Frank called me? I know him peripherally through the industry. He said you found it in 2 hours. Also that you stayed for coffee and talked about a parts warehouse in Gary for 40 minutes, which I found oddly charming. Are you still thinking about the consulting offer? Mason read this twice. Then, I'm thinking about it. What does it actually look like day to day? That depends on what you want it to look like. I'm not trying to pull you out of your shop. I need someone who can look at things differently than my team looks at them. That could be 2 days a month or 2 days a week. I'm flexible on structure. I have a kid, he wrote back. My day has a hard stop at 3. I know, you mentioned that when I visited. 3 is fine. He put the phone down. He picked it up again. Why are you this persistent about this? The response took longer this time, about 4 minutes. Because my grandfather spent the last years of his life watching people look at that Ferrari and not see it, and you walked in with a used toolbox and saw it in 10 minutes. I don't think that's a skill you learn. I think it's a way of being that some people have and most people don't. And I've been in enough rooms with enough experts to know the difference between someone who knows a lot and someone who actually sees. You see, I want that somewhere near these cars. Mason read this several times. He set the phone down on the table and looked at the Lily drawing on the wall, which he could see from the kitchen table on a clear night, the 6-wheeled car that was never going to fall over. He thought about Claire saying, call them back. He thought about how she had been right about that, and about most things, and about how he had learned to trust her judgment even when it ran counter to his own instinct toward caution, and how he had stopped having access to that trust when she died and had been navigating on his own instincts since, which worked well enough but which sometimes felt like crossing a room with the lights off. You could do it. You knew where the furniture was, but you moved more slowly than you needed to. He picked up the phone. Okay, he wrote. Let's talk about what it looks like. The agreement they reached over the following week through a mix of emails and one 40-minute phone call that was unexpectedly easy was this. Mason would consult on Sterling Automotive's private collection on a project basis, his schedule, his terms, with the shop remaining his primary obligation. He would not attend board meetings or press events or anything that required him to exist in a corporate capacity. He would look at cars. He would report what he found. He would fix what he could fix. The compensation was the figure she had named in the shop, which he had accepted after the kind of internal negotiation with himself that left him slightly uncomfortable with his own practicality. He told Cobb about it over lunch at the Dominican place across from the shop, over rice and beans and the pork dish that Cobb had been ordering there for 6 years without ever trying anything else on the menu. That's a lot of money, Cobb said, after Mason told him the number. Yeah. Like a genuinely uncomfortable amount of money for someone who has been charging people cost plus for 3 years. I know. Are you uncomfortable? Mason moved some rice around his plate. A little. Good, Cobb said. Means you're taking it seriously. People who aren't uncomfortable about money are the ones who do stupid things with it. He pointed his fork at Mason. What does Lily think? I haven't told Lily. She's 8, not an infant. Tell her. I will. When? When I figure out what to tell her, Mason said. Cobb considered this. Tell her dad's going to go look at fancy cars and get paid a stupid amount of money for it. Kids understand more than you think. Also tell her before she hears it from Mrs. Hernandez, because Mrs. Hernandez knows everything within 48 hours. Mason looked at him. How would Mrs. Hernandez? She already knows about the Ferrari, Mason. She showed me the article on her phone. She has opinions. Mason closed his eyes briefly. What kind of opinions? Positive ones, mostly. She said you have good energy. She also said you work too hard and don't eat enough, which is more or less what she says about everyone she likes. Cobb pushed his plate slightly aside. Look, I've known you for 4 years, since right after Claire, and I've watched you build something real out here. The shop, what you do for people in this neighborhood. That's not nothing. That's actually something. But I've also watched you turn down every single thing that came your way that suggested you might be allowed to be more than the version of yourself that you decided you were after she died. And I'm not saying the shop is small, I'm saying you're not. Mason did not respond to this immediately, because Cobb was one of the few people in his life who had earned the right to say things like that, and things like that required a moment. She'd have told you the same thing, Cobb said, in approximately those words. I know, Mason said. Okay, Cobb said. He picked up his fork again. Just wanted to make sure. The first time Mason visited the Sterling collection in an official capacity, Marcus met him at the building and took him to a different floor than before. A private basement level that wasn't visible from the street, reached by a card access elevator. The space was larger than the restoration bay upstairs, a long climate-controlled room housing 14 vehicles in various states of preservation, each under its own lighting, each with a card on the wall beside it listing provenance and history in Harlan Sterling's handwriting, or a close approximation of it. Evelyn was there when he arrived, which he hadn't entirely expected. She was standing beside a covered car at the far end of the room, wearing dark trousers and a light-colored sweater, her hair down in a way that was different from both the formal version he'd first met and the slightly hurried version who had visited the shop. She looked like a person in a place she felt comfortable, which surprised him slightly, given that he had calibrated his expectation of her around the 42nd floor executive version. I thought I'd be here to show you around, she said. If that's okay? I know these cars better than Marcus does. It's your collection, Mason said. It's complicated, she said. Most of these were my grandfather's. They feel more like his than mine, but I know their histories. She started walking, and he fell into step beside her. This one is a 1954 Lancia D50. Harlan acquired it in the late 80s from a private collector in Turin. It ran perfectly when he got it, and then about 10 years later developed an intermittent fuel starvation issue that nobody... Are you noticing a pattern? Fuel delivery, Mason said. Every third car in here has a fuel delivery problem, Evelyn said, with the dry exasperation of someone who has been told this by many different experts in many different contexts. My grandfather believed there was a fundamental design flaw in how Italian sports cars of this era handled fuel under sustained cornering loads. He spent about 6 years trying to verify this theory, and nobody could prove or disprove it to his satisfaction. He wasn't entirely wrong, Mason said, looking at the Lancia. The fuel pickup point placement on several of these cars creates a starvation issue under hard lateral load. It's not universal, but it's common enough. Evelyn stopped walking and looked at him. You know that off the top of your head. It's a known issue in vintage racing circles, he said. There are solutions. They're not always pretty. What's the ugly solution? You move the pickup. It requires drilling, which purists hate. What's the less ugly solution? A baffled fuel cell keeps fuel over the pickup under cornering, less invasive, more expensive. She looked at the Lancia for a moment. My grandfather would have chosen the less ugly solution. He had complicated feelings about drilling. Most collectors do. They walked the rest of the collection. Mason looked at each car with the particular quality of attention that Evelyn had identified in the restoration bay. Not cataloging, not appraising, but looking in the way you look at something you're trying to understand from the inside out. He asked questions that were sometimes obvious and sometimes not. The history of a specific repair, the conditions under which a fault had first appeared, whether a car had ever been run on a track or only on road surfaces. Evelyn answered all of them from memory, occasionally cross-referencing a small leather notebook she pulled from her pocket, which turned out to contain her grandfather's notes on each vehicle. Kept notes on everything, she said. He wrote things down by hand because he said it forced him to be more precise than he would have been on a keyboard. That a keyboard let you be vague in ways a pen didn't. He sounds like an interesting person, Mason said. He was an impossible person, she said. He was stubborn and difficult, and he held opinions about minor things with the same intensity that other people reserved for major things, which was exhausting. And he was also the most genuinely curious person I've ever known. He wanted to understand everything, not to possess it or to prove something about it, just to understand it. She closed the notebook. He would have liked talking to you. Mason looked at a 1961 Aston Martin DB4 that had a gearbox issue listed on its card. What makes you say that? Because you do the same thing he did, she said. You approach things without a predetermined answer. Most people come in with a theory and look for evidence. You come in without a theory and look for truth. It's a different process. She paused. It's slower sometimes, but it finds things. He looked at her. You've been watching me work. I've been watching everyone who's worked on these cars, she said without apology. That's how I know the difference. The Aston Martin's gearbox issue turned out to be a worn synchromesh in second gear, combined with an incorrect fluid specification that a previous owner had used without understanding the tolerances involved. Mason identified it in about an hour, and the synchromesh was a part sourcing problem rather than a diagnostic one, which meant it would take time but was at least a solvable problem with a clear path forward. He wrote up his findings in the straightforward way he wrote everything. What he found, why he thought it was causing the issue, what the fix required, in what order. No jargon, no inflated complexity, no suggestion that the problem was harder than it was. Evelyn read the write-up the same afternoon and sent back a single line. This is the clearest assessment report I've received in 3 years. Can you do the rest of the collection? He wrote back, Give me time. Over the following weeks, a rhythm developed. Mason spent 3 mornings a week in the Sterling collection, working through each car methodically, and the rest of his time at the shop in Bridgeport where the regular life continued, Patricia's minivan, Gerald's Subaru, Darnell learning things, Mrs. Hernandez sending food across the street at irregular intervals for reasons that appeared to be entirely goodwill-based. The press had not entirely settled. The Ferrari story had a longer tail than Mason had expected. It kept resurfacing, picked up by different outlets, going through cycles of rediscovery on social media. He had done 2 phone interviews, both of which he had agreed to after the journalist specifically promised not to describe him as a superhero or use the word genius, and both of which had been more or less fine. He had declined everything else, including a television appearance, a podcast, and a request from a documentary filmmaker that had been phrased in a way that suggested the filmmaker did not entirely understand that Mason's answer would be no. Lily had eventually heard about it from Mrs. Hernandez, as Cobb had predicted. Her response had been characteristically direct. You fixed a famous car and it was on the news and you didn't tell me, she said at dinner, with the expression of someone who has discovered a procedural violation. I was going to tell you, Mason said. When? When I figured out what to say. You could have said, Lily, I fixed a famous car and it was on the news. She said this as if it were self-evidently simple. That covers it, yeah. Is that why you're going to the fancy building now? That's part of why. She considered this while eating. Are the cars very fancy? Very. Are they prettier than the Subaru? Gerald would be offended by the comparison, but yes. She seemed satisfied with this. Okay, she said. Can I see them sometime? I'll ask, he said. He did ask. Evelyn said yes without hesitation. Yes. Bring her. Bring her whenever. And there was something in the speed of the answer that Mason filed away without examining too closely. The morning he brought Lily to the collection was a Saturday. She wore her good coat and her hair in 2 braids because she had opinions about what occasion this was, and she stood in front of the Ferrari for approximately 90 seconds before turning to Evelyn, who was crouching slightly to be at Lily's eye level, and saying, Did you actually cry when it started? Evelyn looked briefly startled. Then she said, Yeah, I did. That's okay, Lily said, with the magnanimity of someone granting permission for an emotion. It's a very beautiful car. I'd probably cry too. Your dad didn't cry, Evelyn said. Lily looked at Mason. He doesn't cry at cars. He cried at the end of Charlotte's Web last year. Lily, Mason said. It's true, she said serenely. Evelyn pressed her lips together in a way that was clearly suppressing something. Can I sit in it? Lily asked, looking back at the Ferrari. Yes, Evelyn said. Come on. She opened the door and Lily climbed in with the focused seriousness of someone approaching something that deserves to be taken seriously, put both hands on the wheel, looked at the dashboard, and said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Then she said, It smells like old things. It's 60 years old, Evelyn said. Old things smell good, Lily said. Old books smell good too, and old wood. She ran her fingers along the dashboard. My mom used to say that old things hold on to the time they came from, like they remember. The room was very quiet. Mason was standing a few feet back, watching his daughter in the seat his grandfather had sat in, Evelyn's grandfather, and feeling something that he could not have named precisely, but that had weight to it, a kind of accumulated significance that sometimes descended on ordinary moments without warning or permission. Evelyn was looking at Lily with an expression that had gone past the point of being managed. Your mom sounds like she was very smart, Evelyn said. She was, Lily said. She said it simply, the way Mason had learned to say things simply, the daughter having absorbed something of the father's plainness with grief. She died when I was 4. I don't remember everything, but I remember she said that. Then the memory is doing exactly what she said, Evelyn said. It's holding on. Lily looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, with the nod of someone who has confirmed something they already suspected. She looked back at the dashboard. Dad, she said, this car needs to be driven. It gets driven, Mason said. Miss Sterling drove it. For 40 minutes, Evelyn said. It was the best 40 minutes you'd had in a long time, Mason said. He said it without thinking, the line from the email surfacing automatically, and then registered what he'd said and the fact that he'd said it in front of Lily, and looked at Evelyn. She was looking at him. Her expression was something he had started to recognize, the slight shift that happened in her face when something landed differently than she'd expected. You remembered that, she said. I read the email several times, he said. He said it without explanation, as a fact, and left it there. Lily, from inside this Ferrari, was examining the gear shift with great interest and had temporarily lost interest in the adults. The morning continued. Lily asked 17 questions about 17 different cars, most of them reasonable, 2 of them unanswerable, and 1 directed at a 1958 Jaguar XK150. That was so unexpectedly perceptive about the relationship between the car's proportions and its intended use that both Mason and Evelyn looked at each other across the hood without quite meaning to. Walking back to the elevator at the end of the morning, Lily between them, Evelyn said quietly to Mason, She's remarkable. I know, Mason said. She gets it from both of you, Evelyn said. He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. It landed where it was meant to land, and he carried it out of the building and into the cold Saturday street and into the truck, where Lily fell asleep against the window before they reached the highway, her breath fogging the glass in the small rhythmic way of a child who has had a full morning and is done with being awake. Mason drove home through the gray November city, one hand on the wheel, his daughter asleep beside him, the heater running, the radio low, and felt something in the region of his chest that was not pain, and was not its opposite, but was something in between, something that had been building gradually, in the way that important things often build, without announcement, without drama, just accumulating quietly in the background until one ordinary moment it was simply there. He drove. The city moved around him. The heater ticked. Lily slept. He thought about the Ferrari and the quiet of the basement room, and about Evelyn crouching to Lily's eye level, and about his daughter's hands on a 60-year-old wheel, and her voice saying old things hold on to the time they came from. He thought about how some things were broken in ways that were fixable, and some were broken in ways that weren't, and how the skill was in knowing the difference, and how he had spent 4 years being very careful not to look too hard at which category certain things in his own life fell into. He pulled onto Paulina Street. He parked the truck. He sat for a moment in the parked silence before waking Lily, and the city was just the city, ordinary and indifferent and entirely itself, doing what it always did. He woke her gently. She surfaced slowly, blinking at the familiar street. "Are we home?" she said. "We're home," he said. She nodded, still mostly asleep. He got out and came around and opened her door, and she leaned into him the way she had when she was 4 and 5, when it had been less of a choice and more of a reflex, and he picked her up. She was getting heavy for this, almost too old for it by any reasonable measure, but not quite, not yet, and carried her up the stairs. December arrived the way it always arrived in Chicago. Not gradually, not with any polite warning, but as a hard fact. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 days and stayed there, and the wind off the lake acquired the specific personality it had in winter, which was less like weather and more like an argument you couldn't win. The city adjusted the way it always did, collars up, heads down, the particular compressed efficiency of people who have learned to move through cold without wasting energy on resenting it. Mason's shop got busier in December. It always did. Cold weather found the weaknesses in older vehicles the way pressure found cracks. Batteries that had been marginal all fall finally gave up. Cooling systems that had been neglected revealed themselves through overheating that made no sense until you looked at the thermostat, and tires that had been borderline on tread became genuinely dangerous on the first icy morning. He had been turning away work for 2 weeks, which he hated, and had brought Darnell up to full-time hours, which helped, but not enough. He was under a 2001 Chevy Cavalier on a Tuesday morning, replacing a front axle shaft, when his phone buzzed in his chest pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again. He kept working. When it buzzed a third time in quick succession, he slid out from under the car and checked it. 3 texts, all from different numbers he didn't recognize, all containing variations of the same information. A major automotive manufacturer, one of the largest in the world, German, with a racing heritage that went back to the 1930s, had publicly announced that they were seeking Mason Ryder as a consultant for their vintage racing division. The announcement had apparently been made that morning at a press conference in Stuttgart, which meant it was afternoon there, which meant someone had made a decision about going public with this before anyone had bothered to contact Mason. He read the texts twice. He put the phone back in his pocket. He slid back under the Cavalier. He finished the axle shaft. He washed his hands. He called Evelyn. She picked up on the second ring, which told him she had been expecting the call. "I heard," she said, before he could say anything. "Did you know about this before this morning?" "I heard rumors 2 weeks ago that they were interested in you. I didn't know they were going to announce it publicly." A pause. "I should have told you about the rumors." "Yeah," he said. "You should have." There was a moment of quiet in which she absorbed this without deflecting it. "You're right. I'm sorry." He had not entirely expected the apology to arrive that quickly or that cleanly. He registered it. "What do they actually want?" "From what I understand, they want you to lead diagnostics on their historic racing collection. They have about 60 vehicles in their museum program that have varying mechanical issues. It's significant work, probably a 2-year engagement if you took it, based in Stuttgart, with travel. I'm not moving to Stuttgart. I know that. They may not know that yet. They announced they were seeking me without knowing whether I'd take it," Mason said. "Welcome to how large corporations behave when they want something," Evelyn said. There was something dry in her voice, but not unkind. "They assume the wanting is most of the work. The person wanting back is usually a formality." "I'm not a formality." "No," she said, "you're not." The German offer was the largest and loudest, but it was not the only one. By the end of that week, Mason had received formal inquiries from 2 Italian manufacturers, a British racing heritage organization, a private collector in Dubai through a law firm in London, and a California-based automotive media company that wanted him to host a television series about restoring vintage vehicles. The television series offer was accompanied by a number that made the sterling consulting engagement look modest by comparison. He told Cobb about the television offer over lunch. Cobb put down his fork. "How much?" Cobb said. Mason told him. Cobb picked his fork back up and then put it down again. "Per episode?" "Per season." "How many episodes per season?" 8. Cobb did the math with visible effort. Then he looked at Mason with the expression of someone who is trying to be a reasonable person about an unreasonable situation. And you're going to say no. I don't want to be on television, Mason said. Nobody wants to be on television until they're on television, and then they always want more television. That's the whole history of television. I'm not going to be on television, Cobb. Why not? Because I fix cars, Mason said. I'm not a character. I'm not a personality. I'm someone who is good at finding things wrong with old machines. That doesn't translate to 8 episodes of anything. Cobb looked at him for a long time. You know what I think? You're going to tell me. I think you're scared, Cobb said, without cruelty. Not of the cameras, of the version of yourself that exists if you say yes to any of this stuff. Because that version of yourself is bigger than the version you decided to be. And the version you decided to be is safe because you know where all the edges are. Mason looked at his food. I'm not saying the shop is wrong, Cobb said. I'm saying the shop is not the ceiling. Claire never thought it was the ceiling. Stop doing that, Mason said. Stop using her as evidence in arguments. I'm not using her as evidence. I'm reminding you of something you know and keep forgetting. Cobb picked up his fork for the final time. I'm done. Just think about it. He thought about it. He thought about it while changing oil, while sourcing parts, while driving Lily to school and listening to her current obsession with a book series about a girl who could communicate with animals, which Lily summarized for him in exhaustive detail each morning with the assumption that he was equally invested in the plot developments, which, he had to admit, several weeks in, he sort of was. He thought about it in the Sterling collection, where the work had settled into a productive rhythm. He had worked through 8 of the 14 vehicles, finding faults in 6 of them. Some straightforward, some requiring the kind of sustained attention that meant returning to the same car over multiple sessions, approaching it differently each time until the problem made itself visible. The Lancia D50's fuel starvation issue had been resolved with the baffled cell solution he'd described to Evelyn in their first walkthrough. The Aston Martin Synchromesh had required sourcing components from a specialist in England and a 2-week wait. A 1966 Ford GT40 that had been listed as having an overheating problem turned out to have 3 distinct faults contributing to a single symptom, which Mason had taken quiet satisfaction in untangling over the course of 4 separate sessions. Evelyn was not always present during these sessions. Sometimes Marcus came to open the space and then left. Sometimes she arrived partway through, coffee in hand, and observed without interrupting. Occasionally she stayed for an extended period, and they talked while Mason worked. About the cars, about Harlan's history with each vehicle, about the particular challenges of maintaining a collection of machines that were meant to move and were instead standing still. He had started to understand her better than he had in the early weeks. She was someone who thought in long-time horizons, not a quality that was immediately obvious in a person who ran a global corporation, where the pressures were quarterly and immediate, but it was there underneath, the thing her grandfather had given her. She was also someone who had been performing competence for so long and in so many rooms that the performance had become partially indistinguishable from the person, and the moments when the distinction surfaced were worth noticing. He had seen it the morning she sat in the Ferrari and cried. He had seen it when she spoke about Harlan's notebooks. He had seen it in her quick, clean apology about the German announcement. She was also funnier than he had expected. Not performing humor, not deploying wit as a social skill the way people in corporate settings often did, but genuinely funny in an observational way that appeared when she was comfortable. A dry recognition of absurdity that didn't need to announce itself. He had started to look forward to the morning she was there. He had noticed this about himself and had not done anything about noticing it. The German situation resolved itself in a way that was both simpler and more complicated than he'd expected. He sent an email declining the engagement, citing his existing commitments and his inability to relocate. They responded with a revised proposal that removed the relocation requirement and reduced the scope to a 3-month on-site visit per year. He declined that too. They came back with a consulting structure that would allow him to remain in Chicago and travel only for specific assessments, a structure that, he had to acknowledge, was actually reasonable. He showed the final proposal to Evelyn one morning in the collection, passing her his phone with the email open. She read it carefully. She handed the phone back. "What do you want to do?" she said. "I don't know, he said honestly. "The scope is legitimate. The collection they have it's significant. Cars that haven't run in decades. She looked at the phone in his hand. Would it affect your work here? It would mean some travel, 4 or 5 trips a year maybe. Lily would stay with my sister in Oak Park when I travel. Does Lily know about this one? I told her there was an offer from a company in Germany. She asked if Germany was far, and I said yes, and she said that was a lot, and then went back to her book. Smart kid, Evelyn said. She's processing, he said. She'll have questions in about 3 days when she's finished processing. He knew his daughter. The questions arrived on a Thursday evening during dinner with the deliberate timing of someone who has been holding them until the right moment. If you go to Germany, Lily said, putting her fork down in the way she put things down when she was being serious, how long would you be gone? A few weeks at a time, Mason said, a few times a year. And I'd stay with Aunt Sarah. Yeah. Lily was quiet for a moment, in the particular way that meant she was deciding whether to say the next thing. Then, would you like it? Going? He looked at her. I think so. Yeah. Then you should go, she said. She picked her fork back up. Aunt Sarah's dog is very nice. I don't mind staying there. You sure? Dad? She gave him the look she had recently developed, a look of patient tolerance for adults who needed things stated clearly. You're good at this. The car stuff. Fixing things other people can't fix. You should do it in more places. She ate something. Mom would say the same thing, and you know it. He sat with this for a moment. I know, he said. Okay, she said. Also, Aunt Sarah lets me stay up later than you do, so. That's what I thought, Mason said. He accepted the German engagement the following week. He also, in the same week, quietly turned down the television offer for the second and final time, and declined the Dubai collector and did not respond to either of the Italian manufacturers, whose proposals had been sent through intermediaries and had a quality of wanting him as a trophy that he found uncomplicated to refuse. The story of the Ferrari had not stopped generating its own momentum. In early December, a journalist named Rachel Voss published a long piece in a national magazine, not an automotive publication but a general interest one with a large readership, that was not about the Ferrari itself, but about Mason. She had done the work. She had talked to people in Bridgeport, to Frank DeLuca, to former competitors from Mason's racing days, to his sister Sarah, and to customers from the shop, several of whom had apparently been quite willing to talk. The piece was titled simply The Mechanic, and it was written with the specific quality of journalism that does not try to make its subject larger than he is, but instead shows you clearly what he actually is, and trusts that to be enough. Mason read it the evening it went online, at the kitchen table, after Lily was asleep. He read it twice. Parts of it were uncomfortable. Not inaccurate, but uncomfortable in the way that any accurate portrayal of the interior of your own life was uncomfortable. The sense of having been seen from an angle you hadn't chosen. Rachel Voss had talked to Dolores, the elementary school teacher whose brakes he'd fixed. She had talked to an elderly man named Martin Ostrowski, who ran a small tailor shop on 35th Street, and whose ancient Volkswagen Beetle Mason had kept running for 2 years at a cost that Martin had once told a mutual acquaintance amounted to charity with a polite fiction of payment attached. She had talked to a family named Guerrero, whose transmission Mason had replaced the previous spring, and who were, by the account in the article, not people who could have afforded the replacement at standard rates. She had also talked to Preston, the Meridian engineer who had been in the room the day the Ferrari started. His quote was the one that Mason read 3 times. He walked in and didn't try to prove anything. He just looked. And I've been thinking about that ever since because I have a PhD and I've been trained to approach problems in a specific way. And the training is good. But there's something it doesn't teach you, which is how to look at something without already knowing what you're looking for. He doesn't know he does it differently. That's part of why it works. Mason closed the laptop. He sat in the quiet kitchen for a while. He could hear the building settling in the cold, the particular sounds of an old structure finding its winter equilibrium. Down the block, someone's car started with difficulty and then caught, the engine running rough for a moment before smoothing out. He knew without looking what that probably was. Cold, thickening oil, battery working harder than it should, the ordinary mechanical facts of winter. He went to bed. The article did what articles in large publications do. It spread, was shared, was referenced, generated responses in other publications and on social media, and attached itself to the Ferrari story in a way that made the combined narrative larger and more durable than either piece had been alone. Mason, who had been declining interview requests since November, declined the new wave of them with the same consistency, through a short reply that Marcus had helped him draft, which said he was grateful for the interest and not available for comment and wished everyone well. Evelyn called him the morning after the article ran. "Have you read it?" she said. "Last night," he said. "How do you feel about it?" He was in the shop early, before Darnell arrived, coffee in hand and the space heater just starting to push back against the cold in the bay. "It's accurate," he said. "That's the most I can say about it. It's accurate." "Preston's quote," she said. "Yeah." "He called me after he gave her the interview," Evelyn said. "He was nervous about it. He said he hoped you wouldn't take it the wrong way." "What's the wrong way?" "He wasn't sure. He just felt exposed, I think, like he'd admitted something." She paused. "He's a good engineer, he knows it, and he's been thinking about what you did in that room ever since it happened, not because it diminished him, because it showed him something about his own process that he wants to understand." Mason drank his coffee. "Tell him it's fine. I think he'd rather hear it from you. I don't have his number. I can give it to you." "Okay," Mason said. "Give it to me." He texted Preston that afternoon. Nothing elaborate. A short message saying he'd read the quote and had no issue with it and thought it was honestly said. Preston responded within 2 minutes with a longer message than Mason expected, something genuine about the experience of watching the Ferrari start and what it had made him think about his own approach to problems, and ending with a question about whether Mason would ever be willing to talk through some of the diagnostic principles he used, not professionally, just because he was curious. Mason replied, "Sure. Come by the shop sometime. I'll show you what I mean better than I can explain it." Preston came the following week. He arrived in a car that was immaculate and expensive, and which Mason diagnosed by ear as having a slightly worn accessory belt before Preston had even gotten out of it. He didn't say anything about the belt immediately. He showed Preston around the shop, talked through the Cavalier that was currently up on the lift, walked him through the diagnostic process he'd used on an electrical fault he'd found in a vintage Porsche in the Sterling collection the previous week, and at the end of the afternoon, when Preston was getting ready to leave, said, "Your belt's going." Preston stopped. "What?" "Accessory belt. Faint squeal on startup, higher pitch under load. You'll probably notice it yourself in cold weather. Easy fix." Preston stood beside his car for a moment with the particular expression of someone who has just had an abstract lesson illustrated in the most concrete possible way. "You heard that when I pulled up." "Yeah," Mason said. "And you didn't say anything." "You were just arriving," Mason said. "Seemed rude." Preston looked at him. "You're a strange person," he said, and said it with something that was close to admiration. "Probably," Mason said. These were the days. Not dramatic, not cinematic, not the kind of days that made good paragraphs in a magazine article. Long days in a cold shop with good work in them. Evenings with Lily. Occasional mornings in the Sterling collection where the cars were slowly, one by one, coming back to life. And then the thing happened that neither Mason nor Evelyn had been building toward deliberately, which was how things that mattered usually happened. Not constructed, not planned, but arrived at by the accumulated weight of ordinary time spent together. It was a Wednesday afternoon in mid-December, later than Mason usually stayed in the collection. Lily was at a school winter concert rehearsal that ran until 5, which gave him extra time, and he had been working on the last car in the collection that hadn't yet been assessed, a 1969 Lamborghini Miura that Harlan had acquired in the early 90s and that was listed in the records as non-operational due to an undetermined engine fault. It was the most complex vehicle in the collection, and Mason had saved it for last deliberately. Evelyn had arrived around 3, later than usual, carrying coffee for both of them without asking whether he wanted any. She set his on the rolling tool cart beside the Lamborghini and sat on an upturned crate nearby and watched him work without speaking, which was a comfort they had settled into without discussing it. The Miura's fault was in the lubrication system. Mason had been working toward this conclusion over 2 hours, methodically eliminating other possibilities, and had arrived at a point where he was fairly confident about the nature of the problem, an oil pressure issue related to a fatigued pump combined with a blocked oil gallery in the main bearing circuit, but where confirming it would require opening the engine in a way that was beyond what he would do in this space on a Wednesday afternoon. He explained this to Evelyn. She listened, leaning slightly forward on the crate with her elbows on her knees, and asked 3 questions that were better questions than he'd expected. She had been listening to him talk about engines for weeks now, and it had accumulated into something. "Is it fixable?" she said, "without replacing the engine?" "Yes," he said. "It's a significant job. You'll need a specialist shop, probably 6 to 8 weeks of work. But the engine is original and it can stay original." She nodded. She was looking at the Miura with the expression she had when she was thinking about something she wasn't ready to say yet. "That's the last one," Mason said. He wiped his hands on a shop rag. "I've assessed all 14. She looked at him. "I know." Something shifted in her face. Harlan bought the last car in this collection 22 years ago. Since then, 6 of them have developed faults that nobody could resolve. You've cleared all 6 in 8 weeks. She looked down at the coffee cup in her hand. "I don't know exactly how to say what that means to me." "You don't have to," he said. "I want to." She looked up. "These cars are the last thing I have that I know he touched, that has his attention in it. When they don't run, it feels like part of the conversation with him that I never got to finish is stuck, frozen." She stopped, restarted. "I know that sounds irrational for someone in my position." "It doesn't," Mason said. "When you fix one and I hear it run—" She stopped again, and he could see her deciding how honest to be, the small internal negotiation between composure and truth. "It feels like something unfreezes," she said, "like the conversation can move again even though he's not here." The room was quiet. The climate control made its low, continuous sound. The Lamborghini sat between them, gleaming and still. "My wife used to say that the things people made were the most honest version of them," Mason said. "More honest than what they said sometimes. Because making something requires you to commit. You can take back words. You can't take back a thing you built." He looked at the Miura. "Your grandfather built this collection. Every car in here is a decision he made about what was worth caring about." As Evelyn was looking at him with an expression he didn't try to read, "She sounds like she was remarkable," Evelyn said. "She was difficult," Mason said. "She was warm and she was stubborn, and she was difficult in the specific way of someone who had very high standards for everyone, including herself. She was the best person I knew." He said it without performance, a simple accounting of a true thing. She would have found the whole Ferrari situation very funny. "The part where the room laughed at you?" "She would have appreciated that specifically," he said. "She had a low tolerance for rooms full of experts. She thought expertise was overrated as a personality." Evelyn made a sound that was mostly a laugh. "She and my grandfather would have gotten along." "Probably argued constantly," Mason said. "That was his version of getting along," Evelyn said. They stood beside the Lamborghini in the quiet of the room, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And it was not the uncomfortable quiet of 2 people who had run out of things to say, but the comfortable kind. The kind that existed between people who had been honest enough with each other that silence had become something they could share without it meaning anything was wrong. Then Evelyn said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yeah," he said. "The German engagement, the other offers. If none of this had happened, if the Ferrari had never... would you have stayed in the shop? Just the shop? Forever?" He thought about this genuinely, which meant not immediately. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe. The shop is real. What I do there for people is real." He turned the shop rag over in his hands. "But I think I had been telling myself a smaller story about what I was allowed to be than was actually true. And I knew I was doing it. I just had good reasons to keep doing it." "What changed?" she said. He looked at her. She was looking at him directly in the way she had that could feel like pressure, if you weren't used to it, but which he had come to understand was not pressure, but simply her full attention, which she gave without reservation when she gave it. "You came to my shop," he said, "without cameras, without Marcus. You looked around and you were honest about why you were there." He paused. "People don't do that very often." Come to where you actually are and look at it honestly. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, at the cars, at the long room with its 14 vehicles, and its careful lighting and the notebooks on the shelf by the door that were written in her grandfather's handwriting. I learned it from him, she said. He always went to where the thing actually was, never waited for it to come to him dressed up as something more presentable. Smart man, Mason said. Impossible man, she said. But yes. He gathered his tools. She walked with him to the elevator, which was how she usually ended these sessions when she was present, a small courtesy that she offered without making it into something. Walking him out, the way you walked out someone whose company you'd valued and weren't ready to stop quite yet. At the elevator, she said, "The collection runs now. 6 cars that were silent are running. Harlan would have..." She stopped. Started again. "Thank you, Mason." "You said that in an email," he said, "after the Ferrari." "I meant it then," she said. "I mean it more now." He got into the elevator. The doors started to close, and she was standing there in the long-lit room with the 14 cars behind her, and he said before the doors finished closing, "Merry Christmas, Evelyn." She smiled. The real one, not the professional one, the one that arrived without being called. "Merry Christmas, Mason." The doors closed. He rode up to the lobby level and walked out into the December street, where the cold was immediate and total, and the city was doing what it always did in the early evening, contracting slightly against the dark. The streetlights coming on in sequence down the block, people moving quickly with their purposes. He called his sister Sarah to confirm the pickup arrangements for Lily's rehearsal. Sarah answered on the first ring and said that she had already gotten Lily and fed her something, and that Lily had informed her about the Natural History Museum field trip and the mineral versus rock distinction in considerable detail, and that she, Sarah, was now better educated on the subject than she had previously been. And she said all of this with the warmth of someone who found children genuinely interesting rather than merely tolerable. "She's a great kid," Sarah said. "I know," Mason said. "You doing okay?" He stood on the sidewalk outside Sterling Automotive's headquarters in the December cold. The city moving around him, 6 cars running that hadn't run in years, a plane crossing the sky far above, a German engagement accepted, a television deal declined, a daughter who thought he should go to more places, a woman in a basement room who looked at things honestly. "Yeah," he said. "I think I'm doing okay." "Good," Sarah said. She said it with the particular emphasis of a sister who has been watching someone find their footing for 4 years and is glad to hear the sound of ground under their feet. "Come get your kid." He walked to his truck. He started it on the first turn. He drove south through the city toward Oak Park, toward Lily, the heater running and the radio low and the city all around him, ordinary and enormous and entirely real, doing what it always did. Christmas came and went the way it did when you were a single parent, with a particular kind of concentrated effort that looked effortless from the outside and was exhausting from the inside. The deliberate manufacturing of magic for someone who still believed in it wholeheartedly and deserved to keep believing in it for as long as possible. Mason got a tree from the lot on Halsted Street, a slightly asymmetrical Douglas fir that leaned left and that Lily declared perfect for that specific reason. They decorated it over 2 evenings with ornaments that were a mix of store-bought and handmade, and one clay handprint from when Lily was 4 that had cracked slightly along one edge, but that Mason would not have removed from that tree under any circumstances. Lily got the book she had wanted, and a new winter coat and a kit for growing crystals that Mrs. Hernandez had apparently recommended as educational, and which turned out to produce results that were genuinely impressive, and that occupied her attention for 3 full days after Christmas, which Mason counted as a significant parental success. He spent Christmas Day with Sarah's family in Oak Park. Sarah and her husband Dev and their 2 kids, a house that was louder than his apartment by a factor he could never quite estimate. The specific noise of a full household at the holidays, overlapping conversations and the television on somewhere, and the smell of food from the kitchen traveling through every room. He sat at the kitchen table after dinner with a cup of coffee, while Dev washed dishes and Sarah put leftovers away and the kids had disappeared upstairs with Lily, and felt the particular gratitude of someone who knows that the warm, loud house they are sitting in is not entirely their own, but that it is available to them, which is its own category of lucky. You look better, Sarah said, without preamble, putting a container in the refrigerator. Then what? Mason said. Then last Christmas. She closed the refrigerator and looked at him with the directness of an older sister who had earned the right to it through years of paying attention. Last Christmas you were here and not here at the same time. This year, you're here. Dev, without turning from the sink, said, She's been storing that observation since Thanksgiving. I've heard it 4 times. It's worth saying more than once, Sarah said. Mason drank his coffee. It's been a strange year. Strange good or strange complicated? Both, he said. Neither. I don't know yet. Sarah sat down across from him. The woman, she said. Evelyn Sterling, is that part of the both neither? Mason looked at his cup. You read the article. Everyone read the article, Mason. Rachel Voss is a very good writer. She folded her hands on the table. You don't have to talk about it. Then why are you asking? Because I'm your sister, and it's Christmas, and I can. She waited. You like her? She's a good person, he said carefully. That's not what I said. He looked up. Sarah had an expression that was patient and also slightly merciless in the way that love sometimes was. It's complicated, he said. Complicated how? She's single. I checked. You're single. You spend time together. You've met each other's... She stopped. She's met Lily, right? Several times, he said. And? He thought about Lily in the driver's seat of the Ferrari, her hands on the Nardi wheel, saying that old things held on to the time they came from. He thought about Evelyn crouching to Lily's level, listening with the full attention she gave to things she took seriously. He thought about Lily's assessment afterward, delivered in the truck on the way home, which had been, she's nice and she really listens when you talk, which a lot of adults don't. And Lily likes her, he said. Mason. Sarah leaned forward slightly. Claire's been gone for 4 years. You have been alone for 4 years. Nobody is asking you to replace anything or forget anything, but you're 32 years old and you're allowed to have a life that contains more than a shop and a consulting gig and a collection of other people's broken cars. Dev, still at the sink, made a small sound that might have been agreement or might have been staying out of it. It was hard to tell with Dev. I know, Mason said. Do you? Yeah, he said. I know. He drove home that night with Lily asleep in the back seat, which happened more often than he expected given that she was 8 and theoretically past the age of falling asleep in cars. But she did it anyway, and he drove through the quiet late-night streets of the city thinking about what Sarah had said, which was not anything he hadn't already thought, but which was different when said out loud by someone who had known him long enough to say it with authority. He had been alone for 4 years. Not lonely, exactly. He had Lily and Cobb and Sarah and the neighborhood and the shop and the accumulated texture of a life that was genuinely his, that he had built from the wreckage of a different one. But alone in the specific sense of not having a person who was in it with him, not having someone to tell the small things to at the end of the day. The thing with the Maserati. The thing Preston said. The thing Lily said about minerals. He had been telling those things to Evelyn, he realized. Not all of them, but more than he told anyone else. The new year arrived. The German engagement required preparation. Mason spent 2 weeks in January organizing his diagnostic approach for the Stuttgart visit, reading everything available about the specific vehicles in their historic collection, approaching it the way he approached all problems, which was to understand as much as possible before touching anything. Frank DeLuca, whose Maserati had been running perfectly since the return line replacement, called once to check in and ended up talking for an hour about a 1952 Alfa Romeo that a collector in Milwaukee had recently asked him to look at. Mason talked him through a preliminary diagnostic approach and did not charge him for the hour, which Frank acknowledged with a gruff thank you that was worth more than a longer one would have been. Darnell at the shop had continued to develop in the way that people developed when they were in the right environment and paying attention. He had started asking better questions, not just how to do specific tasks, but why, the underlying principles, the logic of diagnosis before action. Mason answered all of them, sometimes at length, sometimes with a demonstration rather than an explanation, sometimes by handing Darnell a problem, and letting him work through it with guidance only when he got stuck. It was not a formal arrangement, it was just how the shop ran. He was explaining the principles of intermittent electrical fault diagnosis to Darnell on a Tuesday afternoon in late January, using a wiring diagram spread on the hood of a Buick as a teaching aid, when Evelyn arrived. She had not texted ahead, which was unusual. She came in from the street in her dark coat, saw Mason at the Buick with Darnell, and stayed near the bay door without interrupting, waiting. Mason finished the explanation, sent Darnell to start the practical test, and walked over to her. She looked different than usual. Not disheveled, Bob. She was never disheveled. It wasn't in her operating system. But something was off in the arrangement of her usual composure, a slight tension around her eyes that he had learned to read as meaning something was pressing on her. "Did something happen?" he said. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. "Not about the cars." "Okay," he said. He nodded toward the back office. She followed him in and he closed the door, not for privacy from Darnell exactly, but because it was the only space in the shop where two people could have a conversation that wasn't happening in the middle of everything. The office was small and cluttered in the way of rooms that were used primarily for paperwork by someone who did not enjoy paperwork. A metal desk, 2 chairs, a shelving unit with binders and parts catalogs, a corkboard with invoices and a school photo of Lily from September, and a handwritten list of phone numbers that Mason kept because he didn't entirely trust his phone not to lose them. Evelyn sat in the second chair. He sat on the edge of the desk. "My board wants to open a public restoration facility," she said, "under the Sterling name. A training center for automotive restoration, vintage vehicles, professional-grade instruction. They've been talking about legacy initiatives since Harlan died, and this is the one that has traction right now." She paused. "They want to use the Ferrari story as the foundation narrative, the idea of overlooked expertise, of taking a different approach than the obvious one." "Okay," Mason said, waiting. "They want you to lead it," she said. He looked at her. "Not manage it, not administrate it. They have people for that. They want your name on it and your approach in it. The curriculum, the philosophy, the way you teach Darnell out there right now." She looked at her hands for a moment. "It's not a small thing. It would be a real institution. Full scholarship program for..." The board keeps saying underserved communities, which is the corporate phrase for what they mean, which is people like the ones who come to this shop. "Single parents," Mason said. She looked up. "Yes, among others. But that was the specific population I pushed for when they were developing the concept. People who are working and raising children alone, and who can't access conventional training programs because conventional programs don't accommodate 315 school pickups." The shop was quiet on the other side of the door, except for Darnell's footsteps and the occasional sound of him working the test light. Mason heard all of it without looking away from Evelyn. "Why me?" he said, not deflecting, genuinely asking. "Your board could hire a director from any of the top programs in the country." "They could," she said. "I told them I wanted you." "Because of the Ferrari. Because of the Ferrari and because of the article, and because of Frank DeLuca and Preston, and because I watched you teach Darnell for 10 minutes before I came to find you, and in those 10 minutes I saw you explain something complicated in a way that made it obvious without making him feel like he should have already known it." She said it with a flatness that was not coldness but precision. "I've been looking for someone who does that for 3 years. I didn't expect to find them in a neighborhood garage in Bridgeport." Mason was quiet for a moment. He looked at the corkboard. At Lily's school photo, taken in September, she was wearing her blue sweater, the one with the small embroidered flowers on the collar, and looking at the camera with the expression she got when she'd been asked to smile, and was trying to produce one that was convincing. "What does it look like practically?" he said. "You'd set the curriculum. You'd train the instructors. You'd have approval over who we hire to teach. You'd come in when you want to come in and teach directly when you want to teach directly. It's not a desk job." She paused. "The shop stays. Germany stays. This is additive, not replacing. Where would it be?" "That's still being decided. Somewhere accessible. Not downtown. The board wanted Michigan Avenue and I said no." "Why'd you say no?" "Because a training program for working single parents doesn't belong on Michigan Avenue," she said. "It belongs somewhere people can get to on the Blue Line at 7 in the morning. He was quiet for a while, long enough that she shifted slightly in the chair, not impatiently, just absorbing the quiet. You pushed for the single-parent population specifically, he said. Yes. After visiting the shop. After meeting the people who come here. Yes, she said. And after... She stopped, decided to be honest. After learning what it cost you to be one, the career you stepped back from, the life you restructured, and then watching you turn around and give the same care to the people in this neighborhood who needed it. She met his eyes. The Academy is not a charity project. It's a response to something real, and I think you know it's necessary. He did know it. That was the honest truth. He had known it in the particular way you know things that you don't have the resources to act on. A recognition that lived in the back of your mind and surfaced when you watched Darnell figuring something out, or when Patricia paid him less than he deserved for a job she needed done, or when he thought about the people in the neighborhood who could have built careers in this work if the pathway to it hadn't required money and time and access that they simply did not have. I have a condition, he said. She didn't look surprised. Tell me. Every graduate of the program, he said, before they go on to whatever they go on to, before they take the first job, before they negotiate the first salary, they identify someone who needs help, someone who can't pay for the kind of work they now know how to do, and they do the work, for free or for whatever that person can manage. He looked at her steadily. Not as a graduation requirement they can fulfill with a form, an actual commitment made in front of the program to an actual person. She held his gaze. Why? Because the thing that makes this work matter, he said, is not the skill. The skill is just the tool. The thing that makes it matter is what you decide to do with it once you have it. And if we don't build that into the program from the beginning, we're just producing technicians. I can hire technicians. What I can't hire is someone who understands why the work is worth doing. The room was quiet. Okay, Evelyn said. Okay, meaning you'll fight for it with the board. Okay, meaning it's already in, she said. I was going to propose it myself. I wanted to hear how you'd frame it. He looked at her for a moment. You were testing me. I was learning how you thought about it, she said. Those are different things. He almost smiled, marginally. They sat with the agreement between them, not signed, not formal, just present in the room as a thing that was going to happen. Then Evelyn said, more quietly, Can I tell you something that's not about the Academy? Yeah, he said. She looked at her hands. It was the tell he had identified. When she was working up to saying something honest, she looked at her hands briefly first. He had noticed this months ago and had never mentioned it. I have been very good at keeping my life organized into categories, she said. Work in one column, everything else in another, and the everything else column has been essentially empty for longer than I'm comfortable admitting. That's been fine. It's been functional. I'm good at what I do, and I've been able to be good at it partly because I haven't had many competing priorities. She looked up. And then you walked into a room with a toolbox and looked at a car I've been worried about for 3 years, and you fixed it in 8 minutes, and then you showed up in my basement collection and talked about my grandfather with more understanding than most people who actually knew him, and then your daughter told me that old things hold on to the time they came from, and I went home and thought about it for 3 days. She stopped. I'm saying this badly. You're saying it fine, Mason said. I'm saying... She stopped again. There was a particular quality to her stillness in that moment, the stillness of someone who has decided to say a true thing and is finding the specific words. I didn't expect this year, any of it. I didn't expect you. And I don't know exactly what to do with that, but I didn't want to keep not saying it. Mason sat with this. He did not say anything immediately because the immediate response would have been incomplete, and she deserved a complete one. I didn't expect it either, he said. I've been careful, since Claire, about what I let matter. He looked at the school photo of Lily on the corkboard. Not because I decided to be careful, just because caring about something is expensive, and I needed to be careful with what I had left. He looked back at Evelyn. You came to the shop without cameras. You looked at what was actually here, and you kept coming back. He paused. That's not a small thing. She was looking at him with the full attention expression, the one that could feel like pressure but wasn't. "I don't know what the shape of it is," he said. "I have a kid. I have a shop. I have Germany 3 times a year, and now apparently an academy to build. I don't have a simple life to offer anyone." "I don't want a simple life," she said. "I've had a simple life. Simple in the sense of uncluttered. I've been uncluttered for years." Something in her voice was drier now, more like herself. Uncluttered is another word for empty when you look at it in the right light. He looked at her. "I'm not asking for anything specific," she said. "I'm just done not saying it." "Okay," he said. "I'm glad you said it." "That's your answer?" "That's the beginning of an answer," he said. "I don't do things fast." "I've noticed," she said. And there it was. The real smile, the one that arrived without being arranged. He drove to Stuttgart in February. He was gone 11 days. He called Lily every evening on video, and she showed him the progress of her crystal growing project, which had produced a formation she described as looking like a tiny purple mountain range, and which, from what he could see on the phone screen, was actually quite impressive. Sarah reported that Lily was fine and eating well, and had strong opinions about what to watch on television, which was consistent with her behavior at home, and therefore reassuring. The Stuttgart work was different from anything he had done before. A collection of 60 vehicles, some of which had not been started in 30 years, each with its own history and its own specific silence. He worked with a German team that was technically excellent and initially skeptical, which was a combination he had learned to navigate. He did not try to prove anything to them. He just worked, the same way he always worked. And by the third day, the skepticism had begun to shift into the different atmosphere that he recognized from the Sterling collection. 2 people working on the same problem from different angles, finding that the angles complemented each other. He found faults in 11 vehicles in 11 days. Not all of them were solvable on site. Some required sourcing, some required specialist work that the Stuttgart team would need to carry out over months. But he found them, and he documented them. And he sat with the German team on the last afternoon and walked through each one with the clarity he brought to everything. And when he was done, the team's senior engineer, a quiet, precise man named Heinrich, who had been the most skeptical on day 1, shook his hand and said, in English that was careful and deliberate, "You approach problems like an honest man." Mason said, "I try." Heinrich said, "Most people try. You do it." He flew home on a Thursday. Lily met him at Sarah's house with the full update on 11 days of events, delivered sequentially and with detail during the drive home. The crystal formation had been photographed from 4 angles. There had been a dispute with Kezia about something at school that had since been resolved. Sarah's dog had learned a new trick. The book series had concluded, and Lily had thoughts about the ending, primarily critical. He listened to all of it. He had missed it, the specific texture of it, the irreplaceable specific texture of being the person someone told things to because you were the person who was supposed to know. The academy took shape through the spring. Evelyn moved it forward with the particular efficiency of someone who understood how to make an institution out of an idea. Legal structures, facility negotiations, staff recruitment, the 100 practical things that stood between a good intention and a functioning program. Mason's role in those months was consultative, focused, and limited to the things that were actually his to decide: curriculum structure, teaching philosophy, the criteria for instructor selection. He found a building. Evelyn's board had proposed 3 locations, all reasonable, and Mason had driven past all 3 and stood on the sidewalks outside them and tried to imagine the people he wanted to serve arriving there at 7 in the morning with a kid's daycare drop-off already behind them and a full day of learning ahead. He chose the one on the west side, a former industrial space near a Blue Line stop, because it had a parking lot large enough for evening classes, and a bus stop directly outside, and a neighborhood around it that would make the people arriving feel like they belonged rather than like they were visiting someone else's space. He hired 7 instructors over the first summer. 3 of them were people he had worked alongside at some point: Frank DeLuca, who had been retired from the Cicero facility and who agreed to teach vintage diagnostics 2 days a week; a woman named Inez, who had been the best transmission specialist in the city for 15 years, and who Mason had met through a referral chain that went through Cobb; and Darnell, who at 20 was younger than any of them, and whose inclusion made the board nervous until Mason explained that the entire point was to show students that expertise had nothing to do with how long you had been alive. The other four came through an interview process that Mason ran himself, asking each candidate the same set of questions that were not about technical skill. They could demonstrate that, but about how they thought about teaching and what they believed the work was for, and whether they could tell him about a time they had learned something from someone they didn't expect to learn from. The answers to that last question told him most of what he needed to know. The first cohort of students arrived in September. 22 people. 14 of them were single parents. 8 were women in an industry that had not historically made them feel like they belonged in it. Several of them had prior mechanical experience and several had none. They ranged in age from 20 to 47, and the 47-year-old, a man named Robert who had been a mail carrier for 20 years, and whose route had been eliminated and who had always been the person in his family that people called when something mechanical broke, was the one who asked the first question on the first day. Mason had been standing at the front of the main workshop space, which still smelled of fresh paint and new equipment, had not yet acquired the particular smell of a working shop, the oil and metal smell it would develop over years, and had just finished explaining what the program was going to ask of them and what it was going to give back, when Robert raised his hand. "What if we're not as good at this as you think?" Robert said. He asked it without self-pity, just honest. "Some of us have never done this before. What if we come through the program and we still can't do what you can do?" Mason looked at him. Then he looked at the room. "Nobody here is going to do what I do," he said. "That's not the point. What I do is what I do because of 30 years of specific experience that you don't have yet. What you're going to do is what you do with the knowledge this program gives you." He paused. "I walked into a room full of experts and fixed a car that they couldn't fix. That story gets told a certain way, like it was about being special. It wasn't. It was about being willing to look at what was actually there instead of what I expected to find. That's a skill. It's learnable. It has nothing to do with genius and everything to do with patience and honesty." He looked at Robert specifically. "The question isn't whether you're as good as me. The question is whether you're willing to look honestly at what's in front of you. If the answer is yes, you belong here." Robert nodded slowly. He had the nod of someone who needed to hear a thing stated plainly before he could believe it. The first year was harder than Mason had expected and better than he had hoped. 3 students dropped out in the first semester, one because of a family emergency, one because the technical demands were genuinely beyond where they were starting from, one because she found a job in a different field midway through, and it was the right choice for her, and Mason did not try to talk her out of it. 19 completed the first year. 15 completed the full program. The graduation was in June. Evelyn was there, and Sarah and Cobb, who brought his wife and looked around the facility with the expression of someone taking stock of something larger than he had imagined it to be. Lily was there in her good dress, the one she wore to things she had decided were important occasions, and she sat between Mason and Evelyn during the ceremony with the comfortable ease of a child who had grown used to both of them being in the same place, which had happened gradually enough over the year that it had not required a conversation. It had simply become the arrangement. Before the graduates crossed the small stage that had been set up in the main workshop, each of them named the person they had committed to help. Robert named an elderly neighbor who had not been able to afford repairs on a truck he needed for a garden business that was his only income. A woman named Gina named her own sister, a single mother with a car that had been failing for 2 years and that she had been managing with fear and prayer. A 23-year-old named Deshaun named a community center in his neighborhood that had 2 vans for transporting seniors and no budget for maintenance. Mason sat and listened to every name. He did not try to manage whatever was happening in his chest while he listened, because managing it would have been dishonest, and he had spent a year in this program teaching 22 people that honesty was the foundation of everything they were going to do, and it seemed wrong to practice something else in the moment it was most required. Lily, beside him, was very still in the way she was still when something was registering deeply. She was watching the graduates with an expression he recognized as the expression she had worn in the Ferrari, serious and present, and taking in more than she would be able to fully articulate until later. After the ceremony, in the parking lot, While people took photographs and talked, and the caterers Evelyn had arranged set up food on tables near the entrance, Lily took Mason's hand. She did this less often now than she had when she was 4 or 5. She was 9, she had ideas about independence, so when she did it, he paid attention. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "Did you know it was going to be like this?" He looked at the parking lot, at the graduates with their families, at Robert talking to Evelyn with his hands moving in the way of someone who was saying something important and needed the gestures to carry it. "No," he said honestly. "I didn't know what it was going to be." "Is it what you wanted?" He thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. He thought about a cold morning in November 2 years ago, standing at the bay door of his shop, looking at a city that was ordinary and indifferent and exactly what it was. He thought about a room full of experts and one worn red toolbox and the sound of an engine waking up after 20 years of silence. He thought about Claire's voice saying, "Call them back." He thought about Lily asleep against the truck window, and Evelyn's smile without announcement, and Frank DeLuca's handshake, and Preston saying he doesn't know he does it differently. He thought about what he had actually wanted in the years when he had been careful about wanting things, which was not money, not recognition, not to be the person in the room who knew something others didn't. What he had wanted, in the way that wants existed at the level underneath the wants you could name, was to be useful in a way that mattered, to do work that was real, to be a person his daughter could understand clearly, so that when she was old enough to make her own choices about what to build with her life, she would have seen something worth building toward. "Yeah," he said, "it's what I wanted." Lily considered this. Then she leaned against his arm, not quite the same as when she was small, adjusted slightly for the person she was becoming, and looked at the parking lot with him. Evelyn came over a few minutes later. She had been talking to Robert, and there was something in her face when she arrived that was the settled version of her, not the executive, not the composed public version, but the person who had come to a neighborhood shop without cameras and looked at what was actually there. "Robert told me what he's going to do for his neighbor," she said. "He's going to rebuild the entire fuel system on the truck. He said it'll take 3 weekends, and he's already looking forward to it." "He will do it well," Mason said. Because Robert would. Mason had watched him find things in engines that other students missed. He had the quality, not genius, not natural talent exactly, but honest attention, the willingness to look at what was actually there. The 3 of them stood in the parking lot in the June afternoon, Lily between them and slightly against Mason's arm, and the graduates and their families moved around them in the easy way of people who were somewhere they were supposed to be. Evelyn looked at Mason. "Are you going to tell me what you're thinking?" "Probably," he said. She waited. "The Ferrari was never broken," he said. It was what he had told the journalist 2 years ago, in the restoration bay, when they had asked how he had done what he did. He had not fully understood what he meant when he said it. He understood it better now. It just needed someone willing to look at it the way it actually was, instead of the way everyone expected it to be. He looked at the graduates, at Robert, at Gina, at Deshawn, at 19 people who had been overlooked and were not overlooked anymore. "That's all any of this is. That's the whole thing." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Harlan would have said something like that." "What would he have said?" She thought about it. "He would have said that most things that look broken are just waiting for someone patient enough to understand them." She paused. "Then he would have argued about it for an hour with anyone who disagreed." "Sounds right," Mason said. The afternoon moved the way good afternoons moved. Without hurry, with food and conversation, and the particular quality of light in June in Chicago that was generous and specific, making everything look like itself, but more so. Mason talked to Frank, who was already planning the second year's diagnostic curriculum with the specific enthusiasm of someone who had found the thing they were supposed to be doing with this period of their life. He talked to Darnell, who had been offered a full-time instructor position and had accepted, and who was, at 20, more serious about teaching than many people twice his age were about anything. He talked to Inez, who had opinions about the second cohort's admission criteria that were worth listening to and that he took notes on. Lily ate 3 pieces of cake and did not apologize for it. Later, driving home, Lily in the passenger seat now, she had graduated to the front seat sometime in the spring, and he was still adjusting to it. The city in the early evening was the city he had always known. The blue line above them on the elevated track. The restaurants with their lights coming on. The old buildings with their particular Chicago faces, built in a time when people believed that the things they built deserved to look like they had been thought about. "Dad," Lily said. "Yeah. Evelyn likes you." She said it with the matter-of-factness of someone reporting a known fact. "I know," he said. "Do you like her?" He glanced at her. She was looking out the windshield with the expression of someone who is asking a simple question and expects a simple answer. She was 9. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's habit of requiring honesty and her own complete self in every other respect. "Yeah," he said. "I do." "Okay," she said. "Okay meaning what?" "Okay meaning that's good," she said. "I like her too. She listens." She watched the city out the window for a moment. Mom would have liked her. He drove, his hands on the wheel, the city moving. "I think so too," he said. They drove the rest of the way home without talking, which was fine, which was more than fine. The radio was low and the evening was warm, and through the windshield the city did what it always did. Kept going, kept being itself, ordinary and enormous and real. He thought about what it took to fix something. Not the skill of it, not the tool knowledge, but the actual interior thing that made a diagnosis accurate rather than merely confident. It was not intelligence. He had known intelligent people who couldn't find a fault in a running engine to save their lives. It was not experience alone, because Frank had 30 years and had missed the return line on the Maserati. It was honesty, he had come to think, specifically the willingness to see what was there rather than what you expected or needed to be there. Most faults in old machines were findable. Most things that looked irreparably broken had a specific, findable reason for being broken. The work was in the looking, and the looking required a particular quality of emptiness, arriving without the answer already in your pocket, willing to be surprised by what the evidence said. He did not think this was special. He thought it was learnable, which was the whole argument the Academy was built on, and which the first 15 graduates had proved in a June parking lot by naming the people they were going to help. The most broken things he had ever encountered were not cars. Cars were, in their own way, honest. They failed in ways that had reasons, and the reasons were findable if you looked with enough patience and enough willingness to be wrong about where the fault was. People were harder. People who had been told repeatedly that they were not the kind of people who belonged in certain rooms, who had organized their lives around the reduced version of themselves that the world had insisted on. Those were harder faults to find and harder still to fix. Not because the reasons weren't there, but because the looking required someone else's patience as well as your own. It required another person willing to say, "I see what's here, I see what it can do. Let me show you." That was all teaching was, when it was working. That was all any of it was. He parked in front of the building on Paulina Street. He and Lily went upstairs. He made dinner because it was a weeknight, and weeknights had a structure that he had maintained through everything. Through grief and rebuilding and Germany and the Academy and all the ways this year had been unlike the year before it. Because structure was what you gave a child so they could feel the ground under them, so they always knew where home was. After dinner, Lily did homework at the kitchen table while he washed dishes, which was the specific domestic arrangement they had settled into years ago, and which would last, he knew, until she no longer needed to be supervised during homework, which was probably sooner than he was ready for. She went to bed at 9. He checked on her at 9:30, the way he always did, standing in the door of her room for a moment in the dark. She was asleep, the 6-wheeled car drawing visible on the wall above her desk, where she had moved it from the kitchen a few months ago. The crystal formation sat on her windowsill, catching the streetlight from outside. He went to the kitchen and sat at the table with a cup of coffee and his phone. He opened a text thread with Evelyn and typed, "Good day." Her response came quickly, as it usually did in the evenings. Better than good. "Robert told me he'd been trying to talk himself out of applying to the program for 2 years because he thought he was too old to start something new. He almost didn't come." Mason looked at this for a moment. Then he wrote, "The almost is what matters. He came. Because of the program." "Because of him," Mason wrote back. "The program just made it possible. He did the rest." A pause. Then, That's the distinction you care about. That's the only distinction, he wrote. Anyone can build a program. What matters is what people decide to do once they're in it. Another pause, longer. Harlan used to say that the best thing you could give someone was the conditions for them to surprise themselves. Mason read this twice. He sat with it in the quiet kitchen, the building settling around him, the street outside doing its ordinary night things. He was right, Mason wrote. He put the phone down. He finished his coffee. He sat in the kitchen for a while longer, not thinking about anything specific, just sitting, the way you sat when a day had been full in a good way, and the fullness needed a moment to settle. The Ferrari was still in the basement of the Sterling building. He knew it was running well. Evelyn had told him she drove it occasionally now, short distances, within the city, and that every time she got in she thought of Harlan and then thought of that morning in the Restoration Bay, which was, she had said, maybe the same thought from two different directions. He thought about the sound of it catching. The V12 waking up in a room full of silence and stunned faces. The way the vibration had traveled through the floor into his shoes. Some sounds you did not forget. Some mornings you carried with you not because they changed everything. Life didn't actually change that way, not all at once, not in a single moment despite what stories suggested, but because they marked something, a before and an after. A door that opened. He had walked through it. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed. Outside, Chicago kept going. The trains on the elevated tracks, the late-night traffic on the wide avenues, the lake doing its cold, indifferent thing a mile east, the whole enormous ordinary apparatus of the city running through the night the way it had always run, indifferent to any individual life and containing all of them anyway. He slept well. In the morning, he got up at 5:30. He made coffee. He woke Lily, who objected on principle, and then got up without further argument. He made eggs. He listened to her describe a dream she'd had about a horse who could read and who had opinions about which books were worth reading, which was, she maintained, a reasonable premise for a dream. He drove her to school. He came back through the neighborhood, past the park, past the mural, past the hardware store with its handwritten sale signs in the window. He unlocked the shop. He turned on the lights and the space heater. He poured his coffee and pulled up the day's schedule. Darnell arrived at 6:55, on time as always, and said good morning and went to check the parts delivery that had come the previous afternoon. Mason stood in the open bay door with his coffee for a minute, looking at the street. The morning was warm for June, the sky a clean Midwestern blue, the kind of blue that made the buildings look sharp and specific against it. A car pulled up outside. A 2003 Honda Accord, dark blue, running slightly rough on the left bank. He could tell by the idle. A woman in her 30s got out with a tote bag on one shoulder and a child by the hand, a kid maybe 5 years old who was looking at the shop with the interested expression of a person encountering a new kind of place. The woman came to the bay door. "Is this Ryder Automotive?" she said. "Yeah," Mason said. "I called yesterday? About the rough idle?" "I remember," he said. He had talked to her for about 4 minutes on the phone. She worked nights as a hospital administrator. The car had been rough since February. She had been putting it off. "Bring it in." She pulled the car into the bay. Darnell moved automatically to the check-in clipboard. The child stood near the bay door looking at the lift with scientific interest. Mason set his coffee on the rolling cart and walked toward the car. This was the work. Not the Ferrari, not Stuttgart, not the graduation ceremony with its specific weight of accumulated significance. This, a 2003 Accord with a rough idle, a woman who needed her car to run. A morning in June that was just a morning. He put his hand on the hood and felt the engine running and listened. It told him something. It always told him something, if he was willing to be quiet enough and honest enough to hear it. He got to work.